Instead of parades, these men received poverty, suspicion, and silence. The government lost their records, stripped their ranks, and even labeled them as traitors. In this special compilation, we are uncovering the stories of the 5 most decorated black soldiers in American history, and revealing exactly how the country they served tried to erase them. He fought in 3 wars on 3 continents before he turned 30. In World War II, he was shot 5 times, yet single-handedly killed 6 Germans and captured 2 more. But the US Army didn't call him a hero. They called him a spy and tried to erase him. Edward Allen Carter Jr. was born in Los Angeles on May 26, 1916, but his childhood was anything ordinary. His father was an African-American missionary, his mother an Anglo-Indian woman from Calcutta. The family moved to India when Edward was 9, settling near a military base where the young boy became entranced by soldiers and warfare. He envisioned himself as a great warrior, a vision that would prove both prophetic and tragic. When Edward was still young, his mother ran off with the church treasurer, taking the church's money with her. His father was forced to relocate, eventually settling in Shanghai, China. It was there that 15-year-old Edward Carter ran away from home in 1932. Japan had just invaded Shanghai, and Carter wanted to fight. He lied about his age and enlisted in the Chinese National Revolutionary Army. For a teenager who'd spent his childhood watching soldiers, this was his chance to become one, and he was good at it. Exceptionally good. Within weeks of joining, Carter was in combat against Japanese forces. Within a month, he'd reached the rank of lieutenant. He was a natural soldier, fearless and skilled, but his military career came to an abrupt halt when his commanding officers discovered the truth. Their promising young lieutenant was only 15 years old. Carter was discharged and sent back to his father. But the boy who'd tasted combat couldn't settle into civilian life. He enrolled in a Shanghai military school, studying tactics and weaponry with the intensity of someone who knew his destiny. He became fluent in 4 languages: English from his American father, Hindi from his mother, Mandarin from his years in China, and German because he understood that the next great war was coming, and he wanted to be ready. By the time Carter was 18, fascism was spreading across Europe. In Spain, General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, were fighting to overthrow the Spanish Republic. Carter saw this as his fight. He made his way to Europe and joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, an American volunteer unit supporting the Spanish Republicans. It was a brutal conflict, a preview of the mechanized horror that would define World War II. Carter fought as a corporal, was wounded, was captured, escaped, and rejoined his unit. He proved what he'd already known. He was born to be a soldier. When Franco's forces won in 1939, Carter returned to the United States. In Los Angeles, he met Mildred Hoover, a beautiful young widow who would eventually become the first black violinist to perform with the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. They married in 1940. Their first son, Edward III, whom they called Buddha, was born in March 1941. Carter was 24 years old. He'd already fought in 2 wars on 2 continents. He'd risen to lieutenant in the Chinese army. He'd survived the Spanish Civil War. He spoke 4 languages fluently. He was one of the most experienced combat soldiers in America. And in September 1941, sensing the war that was coming, Edward Carter enlisted in the United States Army. The Army didn't know what to do with him, or rather, they knew exactly what to do with him, and it had nothing to do with his extraordinary qualifications. Edward Carter was assigned to the 3535th Quartermaster Truck Company at Fort Benning, Georgia, a supply unit, a non-combat unit. Because in 1941, the American military was segregated, and black soldiers, regardless of their experience or ability, were not trusted with combat roles. Carter's superiors recognized his skills. Within a year, he'd made staff sergeant, but he wasn't training infantry tactics or leading men in preparation for combat. He was in charge of supplies and transportation. The Army had taken one of America's most experienced combat veterans and given him a mop and a bucket. Carter's letters to Mildred reveal his frustration and heartbreak. He wrote to her from Fort Benning in February 1942, his words tender, calling her Darling Mill, Sweetheart, Sweets, Honeybird. He sketched the impression of a kiss at the top of the letter. He signed off, Yours body and soul, yours forever. yours beyond the end. But beneath the romance was bitter disappointment. In another letter he wrote with barely contained rage, "A mop, bucket, and a broom are not worth giving one's life for." He'd volunteered to fight for his country. His country had decided he was only qualified to clean, and there was something else happening that Carter didn't know about. In May 1943, an unidentified Army intelligence officer at Fort Benning opened a counterintelligence file with Edward Carter's name on it. The officer noted that Carter had been a member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, that he'd been exposed to communism, though he wasn't necessarily a communist himself, that he'd spent years in the Orient and had a speaking knowledge of Chinese. The report concluded that Carter was capable of having connections with subversive activities. The Army was already building a case against one of their most decorated soldiers, not for anything he'd done, but for who he was and what he'd experienced. Carter's 3535th Quartermaster Truck Company shipped to France in November 1944. By then he'd been promoted to Staff Sergeant, but he was still in a supply unit, still watching the war from the sidelines while men with a fraction of his experience went into combat. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last great offensive in the West, launched in December 1944, caught the Allies by surprise and inflicted catastrophic casualties. The American Army was desperate for infantry replacements, so desperate that they did something unprecedented. They asked for black volunteers from rear echelon units to serve in combat infantry roles. There was a catch. Non-commissioned officers who volunteered would have to accept reduction in rank. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, who'd fought the Japanese in China and the fascists in Spain, who spoke 4 languages and had more combat experience than most colonels, would have to become a private if he wanted to fight for his country. Carter didn't hesitate. He gave up his stripes and volunteered immediately. In February 1945, he was assigned to the 1st Infantry Company Provisional 7th Army, an all-black infantry unit attached to the 56th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 12th Armored Division. His company commander, Captain Floyd Vanderhoff, recognized Carter's experience and leadership immediately. He restored Carter's staff sergeant rank and made him an infantry squad leader. Finally, after 3.5 years in the Army, Edward Carter was doing what he'd always been meant to do. In March 1945, Carter's unit pushed across the Rhineland toward the Rhine River. The Allies needed to cross the Rhine to reach the heart of Germany, but most of the bridges had been destroyed by Allied bombing or German demolitions. Reports came in that Speyer, a town on the west bank of the Rhine, still had an intact bridge. The 12th Armored Division moved south toward Speyer. On the morning of March 23rd, just north of the town, they encountered heavy German resistance. Carter's squad was riding on top of a Sherman tank when the bazooka round hit. The explosion disabled the tank and sent the men scrambling for cover. They took position behind a road bank, but they were pinned down by machine gun fire coming from a large warehouse about 150 yards away. The Germans had excellent fields of fire. Any American who tried to advance across that open ground would be cut down in seconds. But the Americans needed to know what they were facing. How many Germans were in that warehouse? What weapons did they have? Were there other enemy positions nearby? Someone needed to get close enough to find out. Staff Sergeant Carter volunteered to lead a 3-man patrol. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, Carter and 3 other soldiers left the cover of the road bank and started across the open field. The German machine guns opened up immediately. One of Carter's men was killed instantly, cut down before he'd made it 10 yards. Carter ordered the other 2 men to fall back to the road bank while he continued alone. One of those men was killed as he retreated. The other made it back, seriously wounded. Carter was alone in the middle of an open field with German machine guns trained on him. He kept moving forward. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. One American soldier advancing alone across open ground directly into their fire. They poured everything they had at him. A burst from a machine gun hit Carter 3 times in the left arm. He stumbled but kept moving. Another round hit him in the left leg, knocking him off his feet. He got back up and kept crawling forward. He pulled out wound tablets and reached for his canteen. A German bullet hit the canteen, knocking it from his hand. The round went through his left hand. Carter now had 5 bullet wounds. His left arm was barely functional. His leg was bleeding heavily. His hand was torn open, and he was still 120 yards from the warehouse. But he kept crawling, inch by inch, foot by foot, dragging himself across that field while machine gun fire kicked up dirt around him. The Germans must have thought they were fighting a ghost. No human being should have been able to survive that volume of fire. But Carter reached a small depression in the ground, about 30 yards from the warehouse. He took cover behind a riverbank and assessed his situation. He was badly wounded, bleeding heavily, and alone. The rest of his squad was 150 yards behind him. The Germans were dug in 30 yards ahead of him. He'd accomplished his mission. He'd gotten close enough to observe the enemy positions. Now he just had to survive long enough to report back. Carter lay behind that riverbank for 2 hours. He could hear the Germans talking inside the warehouse. He counted their voices, tried to determine how many there were and what weapons they had. His wounds bled steadily. He pressed cloth against them to slow the bleeding, but he was weakening. The Germans knew someone was out there. They'd seen the American soldier crawling across the field, seen him take cover, but they didn't know if he was alive or dead. Finally, around 10:30 in the morning, they decided to find out. 8 German soldiers left the warehouse and moved toward Carter's position. They were carrying rifles, moving cautiously, trying to determine if the American was still a threat. Carter lay perfectly still, his Thompson submachine gun hidden beneath his body. Blood soaked into the ground around him. He looked like a corpse. The Germans grew bolder, convinced the American was dead. They moved closer. 20 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. Carter waited. He needed them close enough that he couldn't miss. Close enough that his wounded arms could hold the Thompson steady. Close enough that he could be certain. When the German patrol was almost on top of him, Carter suddenly opened fire. The Thompson submachine gun roared to life, and the Germans had no chance to react. Carter killed 6 of them in seconds. The other 2 threw down their weapons and surrendered immediately, their hands raised high, terrified of the bleeding American soldier who refused to die. Carter got to his feet, or tried to. His wounded leg barely held him, but he had his Thompson trained on the 2 prisoners, and he had valuable intelligence to report. He ordered the 2 Germans to walk ahead of him, using them as human shields as he made his way back across that open field toward American lines. The men who watched Carter emerge from that field couldn't believe what they were seeing. He was covered in blood, his uniform torn and soaked through. His left arm hung useless at his side. He was limping badly on his wounded leg, but he had 2 German prisoners walking ahead of him, and his Thompson was steady in his right hand. When Carter reached the American position, other soldiers rushed forward to help him. He refused evacuation. First, he needed to debrief. He'd spent 2 hours observing the German positions, and that information was time-sensitive. Carter gave a full report on everything he'd seen and heard. The number of Germans in the warehouse, their weapons, their defensive positions. Then he turned over his prisoners, who provided additional intelligence about German troop dispositions in Speyer. Only after his debriefing was complete did Carter allow medics to treat his wounds. They counted 9 bullet wounds in total, 3 in his left arm, 1 in his left leg, 1 through his left hand, and 4 other wounds from bullet fragments and shrapnel. Any one of those wounds should have stopped him. Together, they should have killed him. But Carter had completed his mission, killed 6 enemy soldiers, captured 2 more, and brought back intelligence that allowed the American advance to continue. The information Carter provided was crucial to the capture of Speyer. His actions had been extraordinary by any measure. Carter was evacuated to a field hospital in Luxembourg. The medics who treated him were amazed he'd survived. The soldiers who'd witnessed his actions were in awe. His company commander, Captain Vanderhoff, immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Carter's superiors agreed that his actions warranted America's highest military decoration. But there was a problem. Edward Carter was black, and in 1945, the Army's leadership didn't believe a black soldier could receive the Medal of Honor. Carter's commanders discussed it among themselves. They knew what he'd done. They knew he deserved the medal, but they also knew the reality of institutional racism. A Medal of Honor recommendation for a black soldier would be rejected at higher levels, so they made a decision. They would recommend Carter for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. At least that way, they thought, he'd receive some recognition. On October 4, 1945, Staff Sergeant Edward Carter was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation described his actions near Speyer, the wounds he'd sustained, the enemy soldiers he'd killed and captured. It was a prestigious award, but it wasn't what he deserved. Carter recovered from his wounds and was promoted to Sergeant First Class. When the war ended in Europe, he wrote to Mildred. His letter was matter-of-fact about his injuries. "I guess the war debt has written you concerning my getting shot up a little. I have 9 bullet holes in all." He was eager to return home to Los Angeles, to see his wife and his sons. But Edward Carter wasn't done with the army. Being a soldier was his identity. It was what he'd always been meant to be. In 1946, Carter re-enlisted. He was stationed at Fort Lee in Virginia, then Fort Lewis in Washington. The Army recognized his value now. He was handpicked to join a select group of professional soldiers acting as trainers with the California National Guard. He was assigned to the provost office. He received positive evaluations from his superiors. He excelled at every assignment. For a brief period, it seemed like Carter had finally found his place in the peacetime army. But the counterintelligence file opened in 1943 had never been closed. The surveillance had never stopped. And in the late 1940s, America was gripped by a new fear. The Cold War had begun, and suddenly anyone with past connections to socialism or communism was viewed with suspicion. Senator Joseph McCarthy was building his career by accusing Americans of being communist sympathizers. The country was paranoid, and the army was looking for potential security risks. Edward Carter's file flagged several concerns. He'd fought with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain, a unit the army now considered to have communist ties. He'd spent years in China and spoke Mandarin. In December 1945, he'd attended a Welcome Home Joe dinner sponsored by American Youth for Democracy, which the army classified as a communist organization. Never mind that the dinner was honoring returning veterans. Never mind that Carter had no actual ties to the Communist Party. The associations were enough. In 1949, Sergeant First Class Edward Carter applied to re-enlist. He was 33 years old, a decorated combat veteran with 8 years of military service. He'd fought in 3 wars on 3 continents. He held the Distinguished Service Cross. He'd received excellent performance reviews. The Army denied his re-enlistment application. The official reason was vague: alleged communist contacts and allegiances. On September 30th, 1949, Edward Carter was forced out of the Army with an honorable discharge. The military career he'd dreamed of since childhood, the identity he'd built over 17 years of combat service, was over, and no one would tell him why. Carter appealed the decision. He went through legal channels, contacted his congressman, wrote to the Department of the Army, even appealed directly to President Truman. He sought help from the NACP and the American Civil Liberties Union. Every appeal was denied. The rumors about his alleged communist ties followed him into civilian life. He lost 2 jobs because employers heard he might be a communist. In 1950s America, that accusation was enough to destroy a man's career. Carter eventually found work in the tire industry, but it was a far cry from the life he'd imagined. He wrote during this period about his disillusionment. "During World War II, I believed that I was fighting a holy war. I believed and fought in defense of the democracy I now find myself denied." Carter tried to be a good husband and father. He and Mildred had their 2 sons, Edward III and William, plus 2 stepchildren. But the wounds from Speyer never fully healed. He still had shrapnel embedded in his neck. It caused him pain, made it difficult to breathe sometimes. In 1962, doctors discovered lung cancer. They attributed it to the shrapnel, to the damage done 17 years earlier on a German battlefield. On January 30th, 1963, Edward Allen Carter Jr. died at UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 46 years old. He was buried at the Los Angeles National Cemetery, the Veterans Hospital grounds in West Los Angeles, a soldier's burial, but without the recognition he deserved. His obituary noted his Distinguished Service Cross, but the full story of what he'd done at Speyer, what he'd endured, remained largely unknown. For 34 years, Edward Carter's story was forgotten. His family knew he was a hero, but the country had moved on. Then, in 1992, something changed. Secretary of the Army John Shannon commissioned an independent study to investigate a troubling question. Why had no African American soldiers received the Medal of Honor during World War II? Over 1 million Black Americans served in that conflict. Many performed acts of extraordinary heroism. Yet of the 433 Medals of Honor awarded for World War II service, not a single one went to a black soldier. The study, titled The Exclusion of Black Soldiers from the Medal of Honor in World War II, took years to complete. Researchers combed through military records, examining every Distinguished Service Cross awarded to African American soldiers. They looked at the recommendations, the witness statements, the after-action reports. They found systematic evidence of racial discrimination in the awards process. Black soldiers who performed actions identical to those of white Medal of Honor recipients were routinely given lesser awards. The researchers identified 10 African American soldiers whose actions clearly warranted the Medal of Honor. Edward Allen Carter Jr. was one of them. In May 1996, the study was completed and submitted to the Department of Defense. In late 1996, the Carter family was notified. Edward's Distinguished Service Cross was being upgraded to the Medal of Honor. On January 10, 1997, Edward Carter's body was exhumed from the Los Angeles National Cemetery. The next day, he was honored in a ceremony in Los Angeles. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 7 African American World War II veterans in a White House ceremony. Only one of the 7 was still alive to receive his medal. The other 6, including Edward Carter, had died waiting for recognition that never came. Edward Allen Carter III, Buddha, now a grown man himself, accepted his father's medal. President Clinton said, "History has been made whole today, and our nation is bestowing honor on those who have long deserved it." But history wasn't yet whole. The Carter family wanted answers about why Edward had been forced from the army. His daughter-in-law, Aline Carter, spent years filing Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding access to the classified files that had destroyed her father-in-law's military career. In 1999, the Army finally released 57 pages of declassified intelligence documents. The files revealed the surveillance, the suspicions, the vague allegations, but they contained no evidence. Not a single document proved that Edward Carter had ever been disloyal to the United States. Not one piece of evidence suggested he was a communist or had communist ties. The Army had destroyed his career based on nothing but paranoia and prejudice. On November 10, 1999, President Clinton met again with the Carter family in an emotional ceremony in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. The Army's Vice Chief of Staff, General John Keane, stood beside him. General Keane presented the family with corrected military records and belated posthumous awards: the Army Good Conduct Medal, the Army of Occupation Medal, the American Campaign Medal, all the recognition that should have come decades earlier. And then General Keane did something unprecedented. On behalf of the United States Army, he issued a formal apology. The surveillance was unjustified. The allegations were baseless. The denial of re-enlistment was wrong. Edward Allen Carter Jr. had been a loyal American soldier, and his country had failed him. On January 14, 1997, Edward Carter was reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. A horse-drawn caisson carried his casket. An honor guard escorted him to his final resting place. The military funeral he should have received in 1963 finally happened in 1997, with his Medal of Honor citation read aloud for all to hear. Today, Edward Carter's story is taught in military academies as an example of both heroism and injustice. His actions at Speyer are studied in tactical courses. His treatment by the Army is examined in ethics classes. The Navy named a container ship after him, the MV Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter, Jr. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, part of an exhibit on the 7 black soldiers who were finally recognized in 1997. But the numbers tell a more sobering story. Over 1 million African Americans served in World War II. Tens of thousands saw combat. Thousands performed acts of extraordinary valor. And in real time, as the war was being fought, not a single one received the Medal of Honor. Not because they didn't earn it, but because the Army's leadership in 1945 couldn't conceive of a black soldier deserving America's highest military honor. Edward Carter volunteered to lead a patrol across an open field swept by machine gun fire. He continued alone after his men were killed. He was shot 9 times and refused to stop. He killed 6 enemy soldiers, captured 2 more, and brought back intelligence that saved American lives. He did everything his country asked of him and more. And for 52 years, his country told him it wasn't enough. The Medal of Honor citation that President Clinton presented in 1997 reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But those words don't capture what Edward Carter actually did. He didn't just risk his life, he gave his life piece by piece. 9 bullet wounds on a German battlefield, years of shrapnel working its way toward his lungs, a military career destroyed by baseless accusations, a death at 46 from wounds that never healed. What the United States Army did to Edward Carter wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a bureaucratic error. It was a deliberate choice, made again and again, a choice to deny him the recognition he earned because of the color of his skin, a choice to surveil him, to suspect him, to destroy his career because he'd fought for Republican Spain and lived in China, a choice to let him die believing his country didn't value his service. And Edward Carter wasn't alone. He was one of 7 black soldiers who received the Medal of Honor in 1997 for World War II service. 7 men, out of 433 total recipients. 7 men who had to wait decades for recognition, 6 of whom died before their country finally acknowledged what they'd done. The systematic exclusion of black soldiers from the Medal of Honor during World War II wasn't an accident. It was policy, unwritten but understood. No matter how brave, no matter how heroic, black soldiers were not considered worthy of the nation's highest honor. The Army knew this. The commanders who recommended Edward Carter for the Medal of Honor in 1945 knew it. That's why they downgraded their recommendation to the Distinguished Service Cross. They knew the truth would be rejected, so they settled for a comfortable lie. Edward Carter spent 17 years as a soldier. He fought the Japanese in China at 15, he fought the fascists in Spain at 20, he fought the Nazis in Germany at 28, he spoke 4 languages, he was wounded in 3 wars, he earned the respect of every man he served with, and America told him he was a security risk, a potential communist, someone who couldn't be trusted. The Distinguished Service Cross citation describes what Carter did on March 23, 1945, but it doesn't describe what was done to him over the next 18 years. The surveillance, the suspicion, the denial of the career he'd earned, the death in a hospital bed with shrapnel still lodged in his neck, his lungs failing, his country's highest honor still 34 years away. That's not just a story of delayed recognition. It's a story of institutional betrayal. When President Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to Carter's son in 1997, he said the honor was long overdue. But overdue suggests a mere delay, an administrative oversight. What happened to Edward Carter was active discrimination, a systematic denial of recognition based entirely on race. And even after the medal was awarded, even after the apology was issued, the fundamental injustice remains. Edward Carter never got to hold his Medal of Honor, never got to hear his citation read at the White House, never got to see his country finally acknowledge what he'd done. He died believing he'd been discarded, that his service didn't matter, that fighting in 3 wars and taking 9 bullets for America wasn't enough. The 7 black soldiers who received World War II Medals of Honor in 1997 remain the only African-American recipients from that conflict. 7 men out of 1 million who served. The statistics speak to a systematic failure so profound that it took 50 years and an explicit study of racial discrimination to begin to correct it. And even then, only 7 cases were upgraded. How many others were overlooked? How many other Edward Carters died without recognition, their acts of valor buried in files that explicitly noted they were black and therefore ineligible for the nation's highest honor? Staff Sergeant Edward Allen Carter Jr. deserved better. He deserved to receive his Medal of Honor in 1945 when his wounds were still fresh and his sacrifice still visceral. He deserved to continue his military career without surveillance and suspicion. He deserved to die as an old man, surrounded by grandchildren, his medals on the wall, his service honored. Instead, he got 9 bullet wounds, 18 years of suspicion, a denial of re-enlistment, and a grave in Los Angeles that took 34 years to be marked with the recognition he'd earned. That's what America gave the man who took 9 bullets for his country. That's what the Army gave the soldier who killed 6 enemy combatants and captured 2 more while bleeding from multiple wounds. That's what institutional racism looks like when it's dressed up in medals and honors and carefully worded citations that came half a century too late. He was mortally wounded, but still crawled forward, leading his men until he died. He was immediately recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the Army lost his paperwork for 73 years. Freddy Stowers was born on January 12, 1896, in Sandy Springs, South Carolina, the grandson of an enslaved person, the 4th of 10 children born to Wiley and Annie Stowers. His early life followed the familiar pattern for Black Americans in the rural South: work the land, keep your head down, survive. He married a woman named Pearl, and they had a daughter, Minnie Lee. This was the life he knew. This was the life he expected to live. On October 4th, 1917, that life ended. At 21 years old, Freddy Stowers was drafted into the United States Army under the Selective Service Act, legislation that had been passed just 6 months earlier as America entered the Great War. Like hundreds of thousands of other black men, Stowers reported for duty in a military that didn't want him to fight. The American military in 1917 was segregated by law and by practice. Black soldiers couldn't serve in the Marines at all. In the Navy and Coast Guard, they were restricted to menial positions: cooks, stewards, laborers. The Army was the only branch where black men could serve in combat roles, and even then they were confined to segregated units commanded almost exclusively by white officers. Stowers was assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion of the 371st Infantry Regiment at Camp Jackson, South Carolina. The 371st was part of the 93rd Division, a division that would never formally organize, never fully train together, and would be scattered across multiple training camps because the War Department feared racial violence if too many black soldiers gathered in one place, particularly in the South. Here's what that meant. While white units trained as cohesive fighting forces, the 371st trained in fragments, their officers largely Southern whites who viewed their black soldiers with open contempt. White officers refused to salute black officers. Black officers were barred from officers' clubs. Black soldiers ate outside in tents even when indoor facilities existed. They slept in tents with no floors while white soldiers occupied barracks. They washed in rivers while white soldiers used hot showers. The discrimination wasn't subtle, and it wasn't hidden. It was policy. By spring 1918, the 371st had completed basic training and been promoted to the 93rd Division, uncolored. But General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France, faced a problem: what to do with black combat troops. American military leadership doubted their ability to fight. Southern politicians vocally opposed black soldiers serving alongside white troops, and American allies were requesting reinforcements desperately. Pershing made a decision that would change everything for the 371st Infantry Regiment. He loaned them to the French Army. In April 1918, the 371st Infantry Regiment arrived in France and was immediately assigned to the French 157th Division, known as the Red Hand Division, under General Mariano Goybet. The French, who had been fighting since 1914 and had suffered over 1 million casualties, needed bodies on the line. They also had extensive experience with African colonial troops and saw no issue with black soldiers in combat roles. The American soldiers turned in their prized Springfield rifles, their helmets, their packs, all American equipment, and received French weapons and gear. They were reorganized according to French military structure, 194 men per company instead of the American standard, 3 machine gun companies instead of 1. French officers and interpreters trained them in French tactics, French commands, French warfare. For many soldiers in the 371st, this transition marked a revelation. After training in French equipment and learning French tactics, Stowers and his fellow soldiers entered the trenches on June 12, 1918, as part of the veteran 157th Division. They were assigned to hold the Avocaur and Verrières subsectors northwest of Verdun, positions in one of the most contested areas of the Western Front. For over 3 months, the 371st held the line. They withstood artillery barrages, repelled raids, and experienced the grinding reality of trench warfare. The French civilians they encountered couldn't grasp the concept of racial discrimination based on color. As one officer from the 371st later recalled, they said the colored men were soldiers, wearing the American uniform and fighting in the common cause, and they could not see why they should be discriminated against. They received the men in their churches and homes. It was a taste of something most Black American soldiers had never experienced, being treated as equals, as soldiers, as men. But in mid-September 1918, that relatively static existence ended. The French 157th Division, including the 371st Infantry Regiment, was pulled from the line and thrown into the Great September Offensive in Champagne, part of the massive Meuse-Argonne campaign that would ultimately break the German lines and end the war. The objective was Hill 188, also known as Côte 188, a heavily fortified German position overlooking Ardeuil et Montfaucel in the Ardennes region. The hill was critical. Whoever controlled it controlled the surrounding territory, and the Germans had no intention of giving it up without a fight. In the early morning hours of September 28, 1918, Company C of the 371st Infantry Regiment moved into position. Corporal Freddy Stowers, now 22 years old and leading a squad, prepared his men for the assault. By all accounts, he was a good soldier. Steady, reliable, the kind of man other soldiers trusted in combat. At dawn, the attack began. The Germans opened fire immediately. Mortars, machine guns, rifles creating interlocking fields of destruction. The Americans pushed forward through the barrage, advancing up the hill under devastating fire. Men fell, but the line held. This was what they had trained for, what they had endured months of discrimination and hardship to prove they could do. Then, minutes into the assault, something extraordinary happened. German soldiers began emerging from their trenches. They climbed up onto the parapets, arms raised high, rifles abandoned. White flags appeared. The universal signal of surrender. Company ceased fire. Officers shouted orders to hold position, to prepare to take prisoners. The Americans advanced cautiously toward the German trench line, moving into the open, weapons lowered. At 100 meters from the trenches, close enough to see the faces of the surrendering Germans, close enough to call out to them, the Germans jumped back into their trenches and opened fire. It was a ruse, a calculated trap, and Company C had walked directly into it. The German machine guns opened up with interlocking bands of fire, joined by mortars and rifles. The effect was catastrophic. Within minutes, Company C lost over half its strength. Men who had survived months in the trenches, who had made it through the artillery barrage, who had advanced up the hill under fire, were cut down in seconds by an enemy they had believed was surrendering. The lieutenant commanding Stowers' platoon fell. The senior non-commissioned officers fell. Company C, battered and bleeding, faced annihilation. In that moment of chaos, as trained soldiers fell back in shock and confusion, as the carefully planned assault dissolved into carnage, Corporal Freddy Stowers, a squad leader trained to command half a dozen men, took command of what remained of an entire platoon. He didn't have time to think about it. Didn't have time to consider that he was now responsible for dozens of soldiers, that one wrong decision would get them all eliminated. He simply acted. Stowers rallied the survivors. He identified the German machine gun nest that was causing the most casualties, positioned where it could sweep the entire approach to the German line, and he began crawling toward it. Not running, crawling. Moving through the devastation under direct fire, with complete disregard for his own safety, showing the men around him that the assault could continue, that they could still win. Other soldiers saw what he was doing and followed. They crawled after him, a ragged line of American soldiers refusing to break, refusing to retreat, led by a 22-year-old corporal from South Carolina who kept moving forward. The firefight was brutal. German machine gunners poured fire into the approaching Americans. Stowers and his men returned fire, advancing by inches, using every piece of cover, every shell crater. The battle for that single machine gun position lasted long enough that both sides emptied magazines, reloaded, emptied them again, and then the German machine gun fell silent. Stowers and his squad had destroyed the position. The occupants were eliminated. The machine gun that had been preventing Company C's advance was neutralized. But there was a second German trench line ahead, and Stowers knew that stopping meant dying. The momentum had to continue. The attack had to press forward, or the men who had already fallen would have been lost for nothing. So he kept crawling, kept urging his men forward, kept leading the assault toward the second German position. That's when the machine gun fire from the second trench found him. Corporal Freddy Stowers was struck multiple times. The wounds were grievous, the kind that ended fights, that sent soldiers into shock, that made medical evacuation the only priority. He fell, mortally wounded, his body failing even as his mission remained incomplete. And he kept going. The historical record is clear on this point, documented in multiple eyewitness accounts and official citations. Freddy Stowers, dying on a French hillside, continued to encourage his men, continued to urge them forward, continued to lead even as his life bled away. He pressed forward until he couldn't move anymore, until his body simply stopped responding, until he died there in the mud and blood of Hill 188, still facing toward the enemy, still pushing the attack. His squad, inspired by his example, continued the advance. They took the second German trench line. They captured Hill 188. They inflicted heavy casualties on the German defenders and contributed to breaking the German lines in that sector. The battle between September 28th and October 6th, 1918, cost the 371st Infantry Regiment 1,065 casualties out of 2,384 men actually engaged, most of those losses occurring in the first 3 days. The regiment was at the apex of the attacking force in one of the most critical battles of the war. They captured German prisoners, 47 machine guns, 8 trench mortars, 3 77mm field pieces, a munitions depot, railroad cars, and enormous quantities of supplies. They even shot down 3 German airplanes with rifle and machine gun fire. Corporal Freddy Stowers was buried along with 133 of his comrades at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery near Romane-sous-Montfaucon in France, where he remains today. Shortly after his passing, his commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor in combat. The recommendation was clear, detailed, and supported by multiple witnesses. It described actions that were, by any standard, worthy of the nation's highest recognition. The paperwork was submitted, filed, sent up through channels, and then it disappeared. For decades, the official story was simple. No African-American soldiers from World War I had earned the Medal of Honor. Not one, out of the more than 350,000 who served. Not one, despite the fact that 171 African-Americans received the French Legion of Honor, that 123 soldiers from the 371st alone received the Croix de Guerre, that black units fighting under French command received unit citations for extraordinary valor. The narrative went unchallenged for 70 years. Black soldiers, the implication went, simply hadn't performed at the level required for America's highest honor. They had served, certainly. They had fought, but they hadn't achieved the level of heroism that warranted recognition. This narrative persisted through World War II, through Korea, through Vietnam. It became accepted history. In the mid-1980s, several members of Congress began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had no African Americans received the Medal of Honor for World War I service? Was it possible that the military had simply never recommended any? Or was something else happening? In 1988, the Army launched an official investigation. Researchers began combing through archives, looking at Distinguished Service Cross Awards to black soldiers, reviewing combat reports and unit histories. They were looking for cases where racism, rather than merit, might have influenced award decisions. That's when they found Freddy Stowers' paperwork. The original Medal of Honor recommendation was still on file, submitted shortly after his passing in 1918, complete with witness statements and commander endorsements. It had been filed, processed through the initial levels of review, and then stopped, not rejected. Not reviewed and found insufficient, simply not processed. For 73 years, the recommendation sat in a filing cabinet while history moved on without Freddy Stowers. The Pentagon's official statement called it an administrative oversight. Others were less diplomatic. 3 other black soldiers from World War I had been recommended for Medals of Honor. All 3 received Distinguished Service Cross Awards instead, the next highest decoration. The pattern was difficult to ignore. In December 1918, Stowers' commanding officer had upgraded the initial recommendation specifically to the Medal of Honor level. The timing was significant. Military regulations required Medal of Honor recommendations to be submitted within 2 years of the action. Because that regulation had been followed, when the paperwork was discovered more than 70 years later, the process could resume. On April 24, 1991, President George H.W. Bush stood in the White House with Freddy Stowers' surviving sisters, Georgiana Palmer and Mary Bowens. Both women were elderly now, having lived their entire adult lives not knowing their brother had been recommended for America's highest honor. President Bush presented them with Corporal Freddy Stowers' Medal of Honor. It's been said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge, Bush said. On September 28, 1918, Corporal Freddy Stowers stood poised on the edge of such a challenge and summoned his mettle and his courage. The citation was read aloud, 73 years late, but finally read. Corporal Freddy Stowers distinguished himself by exceptional heroism on September 28, 1918, while serving as a squad leader in Company C, 371st Infantry Regiment, 93rd Division. His company was the lead company during the attack on Hill 188, Champagne-Marne sector, France, during World War I. A few minutes after the attack began, the enemy ceased firing and began climbing up onto the parapets of the trenches, holding up their arms as if wishing to surrender. The enemy's actions caused the American forces to cease fire and to come out into the open. As the company started forward, and when within about 100 meters of the trench line, the enemy jumped back into their trenches and greeted Corporal Stowers' company with interlocking bands of machine gun fire and mortar fire, causing well over 50% casualties. Faced with incredible enemy resistance, Corporal Stowers took charge, setting such a courageous example of personal bravery and leadership that he inspired his men to follow him in the attack. There are no known photographs of Corporal Freddy Stowers, no images of him in uniform, no pictures with his family, nothing. The historical record contains his name, his service number, his actions, his medal citation, but not his face. In the segregated South of the early 20th century, few black families had access to cameras or professional photography services. Freddy Stowers remains, in a very literal sense, faceless in history. But his recognition opened doors that had been sealed for decades. The Army Review that found Stowers' paperwork prompted a broader investigation into African American medal recommendations from both world wars. In 1997, 7 African American World War II veterans were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Vernon Baker, the only one still living, received his medal in person from President Bill Clinton. The investigation established what many had suspected. Systemic racism had prevented deserving black soldiers from receiving recognition equal to their white counterparts. Not in every case, but in enough cases that the pattern was undeniable. Freddy Stowers is the only African American from World War I to receive the Medal of Honor. One soldier out of more than 350,000 who served. Out of the approximately 40,000 to 50,000 who saw combat under French command, out of the 133 men from his own regiment who are buried alongside him in France. The 371st Infantry Regiment returned to the United States in February 1919, sailing on the USS Leviathan from Brest and arriving in Hoboken, New Jersey on February 11th. The regiment was demobilized at Camp Jackson, South Carolina, the same place where many of them had first reported for duty, where they had endured discrimination and hardship while learning to be soldiers. Columbia, South Carolina, organized a community reception at Allen University to honor the 371st. Governor Robert Archer Cooper and African-American community leaders spoke at the event on February 29, 1919. The local newspaper reported, "This historic city has set a fine example for other cities in the South in its interest in the return of the soldiers of the 371st Infantry from France." Thousands of both races turned out to see the parade, these soldiers being the first to return in a body, having seen actual fighting. The white people dropped the color line, and not only viewed the parade, but joined the shouting and crying for joy. It was a brief moment of recognition. Then the soldiers dispersed, returning to their communities, to their lives, to a country that still practiced legal segregation, that still denied them voting rights, that still treated them as second-class citizens despite their service. Many found that wearing the uniform made them targets. Black veterans were assaulted for not knowing their place. Some were attacked for wearing their uniforms in public. Lynchings of black veterans increased in the years following World War I, men who had fought for American democracy abroad, punished for expecting it at home. The French, meanwhile, maintained their high opinion of the 371st Infantry Regiment. For its service in the Champagne offensive, the entire regiment received the Croix de Guerre with palm, a unit citation for extraordinary valor. 3 officers received the French Legion of Honor. 123 men won individual Croix de Guerre awards. 26 earned the Distinguished Service Cross. A monument to the 371st Infantry Regiment was erected near the French towns of Ardeuil and Séchaux, where they fought. The monument lists the names of the men who fell, including Corporal Freddy Stowers. The top of the monument was damaged when it was struck by an artillery shell during World War II, but it still stands, a lasting tribute in France to soldiers their own country struggled to remember. Today, several locations honor Freddy Stowers' memory. Stowers Elementary School at Fort Benning, Georgia, bears his name. The Corporal Freddy Stowers Single Soldier Billeting Complex at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where his military service began, is named in his honor. The 371st Infantry Regiment WWI Memorial Monument Association has worked to ensure that the regiment's contributions are not forgotten. But perhaps the most important legacy isn't in the buildings or monuments. It's in what Freddy Stowers' recognition represented. An acknowledgement that America had failed to honor its heroes equitably, that racism had corrupted the process of recognizing valor, that men had performed extraordinary acts of courage only to be forgotten because of the color of their skin. The question that haunts this story isn't what Freddy Stowers did on Hill 188. The record is clear. He led his men under impossible circumstances, destroyed enemy positions, and continued fighting even as he was mortally wounded. He displayed courage, leadership, and devotion to duty that exceeded the requirements of the Medal of Honor by any reasonable standard. The question is, how many others were there? How many other Freddy Stowers were there in World War I, their recommendations not processed, their paperwork lost, their heroism forgotten? How many in World War II? How many across American military history? We know about Freddy Stowers because Congress asked questions in the 1980s, because researchers went looking, because his paperwork happened to survive 73 years in an archive. But the 371st Infantry Regiment suffered 1,065 casualties in 8 days of fighting. Company C lost over half its strength in minutes. The entire American Expeditionary Force suffered over 320,000 casualties in World War I. Among those casualties, how many acts of extraordinary valor went unrecognized? How many heroes were buried without honor because the system designed to recognize them was corrupted by racism? Freddy Stowers was 22 years old when he led his squad toward that German machine gun nest. He was the fourth of 10 children, a husband, a father to a little girl who would grow up without him. He was a farmer from South Carolina who had been drafted into a war he didn't start, assigned to a segregated unit in a discriminatory military, and sent to fight in a foreign country for democratic ideals that didn't apply to him at home. He did it anyway, not because the system deserved his courage, but because his fellow soldiers needed his leadership, because the mission required it, because in that moment on Hill 188, with half his company dead or wounded, with German machine guns tearing through the survivors, someone needed to move forward, and Freddy Stowers decided that someone would be him. That's what heroism looks like. Not the absence of fear, not superhuman ability, not special training or divine intervention, just an ordinary person making an extraordinary choice when everything else has fallen apart, choosing to act when action seems impossible, choosing to lead when leadership might cost everything. Freddy Stowers made that choice. He paid for it with his life, and America made him wait 73 years for recognition. His story matters not just because of what he did, but because of what was done to him afterward. Because administrative oversight is too gentle a term for what happened to Freddy Stowers' Medal of Honor recommendation. Because his sisters had to wait until they were elderly women to learn that their brother had been recommended for America's highest honor. Because for 7 decades, the narrative stood unchallenged. No African Americans from World War I had earned the Medal of Honor. That narrative was a lie, and dismantling that lie required congressional intervention, an army investigation, and researchers willing to dig through 70 years of archives. The single-soldier billeting complex at Fort Jackson stands as a reminder, named for a man who trained on those same grounds over a century ago. New soldiers arriving there learn the story of Corporal Freddy Stowers, of the 73-year wait, of courage that couldn't be erased even when the system tried its best to forget. At the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in France, grave marker number 12 in Plot G, row 13, bears his name. Corporal Freddy Stowers, Company C, 371st Infantry Regiment, born January 12, 1896, passed September 28, 1918, age 22. The marker doesn't mention the Medal of Honor awarded in 1991. It doesn't describe the actions on Hill 188, the false surrender, the desperate charge, the heroic leadership. It's just a name, a rank, a unit, dates. One grave among thousands in that cemetery, one soldier among millions who served, one American among the countless who gave everything for a country that didn't always give everything back. But Freddy Stowers' grave is different now, because his story is known, because his actions have been recognized, because the lie has been exposed, and the truth has been told, even if it took 73 years. That's what we owe to history, not just remembering the heroes, but remembering why they were forgotten, and ensuring it never happens again. He was the most qualified black officer in America, on track to become its first general. But when World War I began, the Army suddenly declared him medically unfit and forced him to retire. But was he actually unwell? June 1918, a 53-year-old man climbs onto his horse in Wilberforce, Ohio, preparing for a journey that would take him nearly 500 miles to Washington, D.C. His body was supposedly too weak for military service, his blood pressure too high, his health too compromised. But Colonel Charles Young had something to prove, and for the next 16 days he would ride through the heart of America to show them all exactly how wrong they were. Charles Young was born into the chains of slavery on March 12, 1864, in Mays Lick, Kentucky. His parents, Gabriel and Arminta, were enslaved when he entered the world, but his father refused to accept that destiny. In early 1865, as the Civil War reached its final violent conclusion, Gabriel Young made a decision that would shape not just his life, but the trajectory of his son's future. He escaped across the Ohio River to Ripley, Ohio, and enlisted in the 5th United States Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment. When Gabriel was honorably discharged in 1866, he returned to Kentucky and moved his family north to Ripley, a town known for its abolitionist history and its role in the Underground Railroad. Here, young Charles grew up surrounded by stories of resistance, of men who had fought for their freedom. His mother Arminta, remarkably educated for someone who had been enslaved, instilled in her son a hunger for knowledge. Charles excelled in school, particularly in languages and music. By the time he graduated from Ripley's Integrated High School in 1881, he stood at the top of his class. But excellence, as Charles would learn, meant little in an America still wrestling with what it meant to be free. In 1883, at his father's urging, 19-year-old Charles Young took the entrance examination for the United States Military Academy at West Point. He scored second overall. When the first-place candidate withdrew, Young received his appointment from Ohio Congressman Alphonso Hart. On June 10, 1884, he reported to West Point, becoming only the 9th African-American ever admitted to the academy. What awaited him there was a special kind of torment that white cadets would never know. At West Point, there was a practice called silencing. It was psychological warfare disguised as discipline. Black cadets were ostracized completely. No social interaction, no study groups, no casual conversation. White cadets, and in many instances, faculty members, participated in this collective effort to break the spirits of black students. They spoke to them only when officially required to do so. The goal was simple: make them so isolated, so miserable, that they would resign. Young entered West Point with one other black cadet, John Hanks Alexander, who had entered the previous year. The two became roommates, a small island of companionship in a sea of hostility. But even that wasn't enough to shield Young from the daily cruelties. His only other social interactions came from conversing in German with the black shoeshines at the academy, men who worked there but weren't subjected to the same vicious social isolation. Young struggled with mathematics and had to repeat his first year. Later, he would fail an engineering class in his final year, nearly missing graduation entirely. But here, something remarkable happened. George Washington Goethals, the Army engineer who would later direct construction of the Panama Canal, was Young's engineering instructor. Goethals saw something in Young that his fellow cadets refused to acknowledge: potential, intelligence, humanity. He tutored Young throughout the summer of 1889, ensuring he passed the exam. In August 1889, Charles Young became the third African-American to graduate from West Point. There was no ceremony for his achievement, no applause. The institution that had tried so hard to break him simply commissioned him as a second lieutenant and sent him on his way. It would be 47 years before another black cadet graduated from the academy. Young was first assigned to the 10th U.S. Cavalry, then to the 9th U.S. Cavalry, both part of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers regiments. These all-black units had distinguished themselves on the western frontier, earning respect through their courage and discipline. But Young's assignments revealed another truth about military service for black officers. He would spend his entire career in a carefully constructed cage. From 1889 to 1890, he served at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. From 1890 to 1894, at Fort Duchesne, Utah. Then, in 1894, he was assigned to Wilberforce University in Ohio to lead the military science department. The pattern was already emerging. Black officers were rotated through a limited circuit of assignments that ensured they would never command white troops. At Wilberforce, Young befriended W.E.B. Du Bois, who taught classics at the university. The two became close, bound by their shared understanding of what it meant to navigate a world determined to limit their potential. Years later, Du Bois would write of Young, "The life of Charles Young was a triumph of tragedy. No one ever knew the truth about the hell he went through at West Point. He seldom even mentioned it. The pain was too great." When the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, Young was promoted to Major of Volunteers and given command of the 9th Ohio Infantry Regiment, a black unit. Despite its name, the regiment was only battalion-sized with 4 companies. The war ended before they could be sent overseas, but Young had proven something crucial. He could lead. After the war, Young returned to the 9th Cavalry with his regular Army rank of first lieutenant. He was promoted to captain in 1901, becoming the first black officer in the regular army to achieve that rank. His career took him across the American Empire. He served in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. In 1903, he commanded a black company at the Presidio of San Francisco. That same year, Captain Young received an assignment that would make history, acting superintendent of Sequoia and General Grant National Parks. At the time, the U.S. Army administered all national parks, and Young became the first African American to serve as a national park superintendent. Previous superintendents had struggled to make progress in the parks. Funding was limited, work seasons were short, and the challenges were immense. In the 3 summers before Young's arrival, barely 5 miles of road had been constructed, but Young approached the assignment with characteristic determination. He started work earlier than previous superintendents, immediately sending troops to all park access points to stop poaching and illegal grazing. He coordinated with the local landowners, building relationships where others had failed. Under Young's leadership, his troops accomplished more in 1 summer than had been done in the previous 3 years combined. They completed a wagon road to the giant forest, home to the world's largest trees, and built a road to the base of Morro Rock. Over 11 miles of new roads were constructed, and more than 18 miles of trails were improved. His all-white road crews respected him. The local townspeople admired him. They wanted to name a tree in his honor. Young declined. He told them if they still wanted to honor him in 20 years, he would consider it. Instead, he suggested they name a tree after Booker T. Washington. They did. It would take 100 years for a tree to be named after Young in that park. After Sequoia, Young's career continued its exceptional trajectory within its carefully limited bounds. In 1904, he became the first African-American military attaché, appointed to serve in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He was fluent in French, Spanish, German, Latin, and Greek. He was an accomplished musician who played piano, violin, and guitar. He wrote a book titled The Military Morale of Nations and Races, published in 1912 and dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt. In it, he challenged prevailing theories about racial character, using history and social science to demonstrate that all races possessed military capability when given proper opportunity. In 1912, Young was appointed military attaché to Liberia. He spent 3 years advising the Liberian government, supervising infrastructure construction, and organizing and training the Liberian Frontier Force. On August 28, 1912, he was promoted to major, becoming the first African-American to achieve that rank in the regular armed services. His work in Liberia was so exceptional that in 1916, the NAACP awarded him the Spingarn Medal, given annually to the African-American, demonstrating the highest achievement and contributions. But as Young's star rose, so did the fear among white officers about what that meant for the military hierarchy. In 1916, Young was assigned to the 10th Cavalry as a squadron commander. He participated in the punitive expedition into Mexico, leading troops in the pursuit of Pancho Villa along the U.S.-Mexican border. Young and his soldiers performed brilliantly under the command of General John Blackjack Pershing. His exceptional leadership earned him a promotion to lieutenant colonel on July 1, 1916, making him the first African-American to attain that rank. Then America entered World War I, and everything changed. Young was assigned as commander of Fort Huachuca in Arizona, home of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. He was the most experienced black officer in the United States Army. He had served in combat in the Philippines, in Mexico, across the American West. He spoke multiple languages, had diplomatic experience, and commanded the respect of everyone who served under him. Logic dictated he would be a natural choice to command black troops heading to Europe. He might even be promoted to brigadier general. But white officers, particularly those from the segregated South, were horrified at the prospect of serving under or alongside a black general officer. A white lieutenant named Albert Dockery, who served under Young, complained to the War Department that he did not wish to serve under a black man. Secretary of War Newton D. Baker told Dockery he should either do his duty or resign. Senator John Sharp Williams of Mississippi complained to President Woodrow Wilson on the lieutenant's behalf. Wilson overruled his Secretary of War and had the lieutenant transferred. The message was clear. Charles Young would not be allowed to rise any higher. In May 1917, Young went for a routine physical examination in preparation for being sent to Europe. The doctor found signs of high blood pressure and protein in his urine, suggesting possible kidney damage. A medical board examined him. 2 separate boards recommended that his physical condition be waived and that he be promoted and kept on active duty. The chief medical officer disagreed. On June 22, 1917, Charles Young was promoted to colonel, becoming the first African American to achieve that rank in the United States Army. But the promotion was hollow. On July 31, 1917, he was forced into medical retirement. At 53 years old, supposedly too ill to serve, Colonel Young watched as younger, less experienced officers prepared to lead troops into combat, while he was sidelined. The NAACP launched an intensive lobbying effort. Friends and supporters wrote letters on his behalf. Theodore Roosevelt, who had served alongside Young during the Spanish-American War, recommended him to lead a volunteer regiment. Young himself pleaded with the War Department, writing letter after letter requesting to be returned to active duty. Nothing worked. For an entire year, Young fought the decision. He taught military science at Wilberforce University, training young black men for a war he wasn't allowed to fight. The frustration must have been unbearable. He had spent his entire life proving himself, excelling at every assignment, breaking barrier after barrier, only to be told at the moment when his country needed experienced officers most that he was too sick to serve. So Charles Young decided to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. On June 6, 1918, after the school year ended, Colonel Young mounted his horse in Wilberforce. Over the next 16 days, he would ride 497 miles to Washington, D.C., walking on foot for 15 minutes of every hour. He rode through Ohio, through Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and finally into the nation's capital. He covered 94 miles in the first 3 days alone. Think about what this meant. A 53-year-old man, supposedly debilitated by high blood pressure and kidney disease, riding nearly 500 miles on horseback to prove his physical fitness. People recognized him in towns along the way. Newspapers covered his journey. The Cleveland Advocate reported, Washington's colored population was agreeably surprised today with the arrival of Colonel Charles Young, who came all the way from Wilberforce, Ohio, his home a distance of 497 miles, on horseback and foot. The colonel looks fit for an endurance hike, or for service at the front. Young arrived in Washington in remarkable physical condition. He had proven beyond any doubt that he was fit for duty. He met with officials. He showed them what a supposedly sick man could accomplish. He demonstrated that the medical retirement was exactly what everyone knew it was, a pretext to keep a black officer from achieving general rank. But President Woodrow Wilson, who had resegregated federal offices and screened the birth of a nation in the White House, was not moved by Charles Young's extraordinary protest. The medical retirement stood. Young returned to Wilberforce, forced to watch the war from the sidelines. Then, on November 6, 1918, 5 days before the armistice that would end World War I, the War Department suddenly recalled Colonel Young to active duty. He was assigned to Camp Grant in Illinois to train black soldiers for non-combat duties as stevedores and laborers. The war ended 5 days later. Young had been given just enough service to maintain his commission, but not enough to see combat or earn promotion. It was a final insult, wrapped in bureaucratic procedure. In 1919, the State Department requested that Young be sent once again to serve as military attaché to Liberia. He sailed for England in January 1920 with his wife Ada and their 2 children, Charles Noel and Marie Aurelia. While his family went to France, Young continued to Liberia, arriving in Monrovia in February. The War Department also tasked him with intelligence gathering throughout Africa. The assignment was, in many ways, the Army's way of sending Young as far away as possible. He was too accomplished to be dismissed entirely, too respected within the black community to be openly disgraced, but too dangerous to white supremacy to be allowed prominence in America or Europe. In November 1921, Young's duties took him on a reconnaissance mission to Lagos, Nigeria. There, the kidney disease that the Army had diagnosed 4 years earlier finally manifested in full force. On January 8, 1922, at age 57, Colonel Charles Young died of acute nephritis at the British hospital in Lagos. The irony was devastating. The medical condition that had been used as a pretext to deny him service had indeed existed all along. Young had pushed through it with sheer determination, riding 497 miles despite failing kidneys, serving in Africa despite deteriorating health, because he believed in duty, honor, and country, even when his country refused to believe in him. British law required that Young be buried in Lagos for 1 year before his remains could be repatriated. His widow Ada and countless supporters in the black community fought through the bureaucratic obstacles to bring his body home. On June 1, 1923, Colonel Charles Young's remains arrived in New York to a hero's welcome. Crowds gathered to honor his long and accomplished career. His funeral service was held at the Memorial Amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery. He became only the 4th soldier in American history to receive this honor. He was buried in Section 3, Grave 1730, with full military honors. The New York Times ran his obituary, acknowledging his national reputation and unique achievements. But the title on his tombstone read Colonel, not Brigadier General. The rank he had been qualified for, the rank he would have achieved if not for the color of his skin, remained forever out of reach. W.E.B. Du Bois delivered the eulogy at Young's funeral. His words captured the terrible complexity of Young's life. The life of Charles Young was a triumph of tragedy. Few knew what faced him always in his army life. It was not enough for him to do well. He must always do better, and so much and so conspicuously better as to disarm the scoundrels that ever trailed him. He lived in the army surrounded by insult and intrigue, and yet he set his teeth and kept his soul serene and triumphed. Du Bois spoke of how Young had to be perfect, always, because any mistake would be used as evidence against all black officers. He described how Young had to endure insults with grace, because reacting would be seen as proof that black men couldn't handle command. He talked about how white officers who should have saluted Young instead pretended not to see him, and how Young simply carried on, refusing to let hatred break him. Du Bois also noted the bitter final assignment. They sent him to the fever coast of Africa. They ordered him to make roads back in the haunted jungle. He knew what they wanted and intended. He could have escaped it by accepting his retirement from active service, refusing his call to active duty, and then he could have lounged and lived at leisure on his retirement pay. But Africa needed him. He did not yell and collect money and advertise great schemes and parade in crimson. He just went quietly, ignoring appeal and protest. For decades, Young's story faded from public memory. His achievements were footnotes in military history books, if they were mentioned at all. His house in Wilberforce, which he had purchased in 1907 and named Youngsholm, was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1974. But even then, his story remained largely unknown to most Americans. In 2013, President Barack Obama designated Youngsholm as the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument, the 401st unit of the National Park System. The house, built in 1856, had once been a station on the Underground Railroad. In purchasing it, Young had created a symbol of how far his family had come from slavery to military service to property ownership. The designation brought renewed attention to Young's remarkable life. But the most significant recognition came on November 1, 2021. Under-Secretary of Defense Gilbert Cisneros, Jr. approved a request from Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear to posthumously promote Colonel Charles Young to Brigadier General. On April 29, 2022, exactly 100 years after his death, a promotion ceremony was held at the United States Military Academy at West Point, the place where Young had endured years of torment to earn his commission. Charles Young's great-niece, Renata Young, attended the ceremony. She told reporters, "This promotion was a long time coming and overdue. You can't imagine how many times over the years military officials, various White House staffers told me this promotion could not be accomplished. Our family doctrine says don't give up. Find a path, an angle, an ally, a change in the protocol or regulation to reach the desired results." The posthumous promotion made Young retroactively the first African-American general officer in the history of the United States Army. It was recognition that came a century too late, but it was recognition nonetheless. Charles Young's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American military history. He was not denied command because he lacked ability. He graduated from West Point. He served with distinction in multiple conflicts. He spoke 5 languages. He was respected by everyone who served under him, regardless of race. He accomplished more in one summer as a national park superintendent than his predecessors had in 3 years. He led troops in combat, advised foreign governments, and trained the next generation of officers. He was denied his rightful place in military leadership for one reason: the color of his skin. The Army's forced medical retirement of Young in 1917 was part of a larger pattern of systematic exclusion. During World War I, approximately 380,000 African Americans served in the U.S. military, but the Army worked deliberately to prevent the development of a black officer corps that might challenge racial hierarchies after the war. Young should have commanded the Fort Des Moines training facility for black officers, but that position was given to white officers instead. Many black officers who were trained were subsequently pushed out of leadership positions or denied combat assignments. The Army's treatment of Young sent a clear message. Excellence didn't matter, achievement didn't matter, dedication didn't matter. When it came time for a black officer to rise to the highest ranks, the institution would find a way to stop it, whether through medical pretexts, administrative roadblocks, or simple refusal. Young understood this. He understood it when white cadets silenced him at West Point. He understood it when he was rotated through limited assignments that kept him away from commanding white troops. He understood it when his protest ride to Washington failed to change anyone's mind. He understood it when they sent him to Africa while the war raged in Europe. And yet he persisted. He pursued excellence not because it would guarantee fair treatment, but because he believed that future generations of black officers would need examples to follow. He needed to prove that it could be done, that a black man could graduate from West Point, could command troops, could serve with distinction, could earn every promotion through merit. In this, he succeeded. His career, despite all the barriers placed in his path, paved the way for officers like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who graduated from West Point in 1936 and went on to command the Tuskegee Airmen. It paved the way for Colin Powell, who became the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It paved the way for every black officer who has served in the U.S. military since. But we must also remember what Young's story cost him: the psychological toll of being silenced at West Point, the frustration of being held back from commands he was qualified for, the humiliation of being forced into medical retirement when he was at the peak of his abilities, the bitterness of watching the war from the sidelines while less experienced officers led troops into battle, the exhaustion of having to prove himself over and over again, knowing that one mistake would be used to justify discrimination against all black officers who came after him. W.E.B. Du Bois called Young's life a triumph of tragedy, and that description captures something essential. Young triumphed in that he achieved more than almost any black officer of his generation, broke barriers that had seemed unbreakable, and created a legacy that would inspire future generations. But it was tragic that he had to fight so hard for opportunities that white officers received automatically. Tragic that his abilities were constrained by racism. Tragic that he died without receiving the rank he had earned. Tragic that recognition came only in death, a century later, when the wrongs could be acknowledged but never corrected. Today, African Americans make up more than 20% of active duty Army members. The military has become one of the most integrated institutions in American society. Black officers serve at every rank, including general, officer positions that Young was denied. The path that seemed impossible in 1917 has become routine, but that progress didn't happen naturally. It happened because men like Charles Young refused to accept the limitations placed on them. It happened because Young endured years of isolation and discrimination to graduate from West Point, proving that black men could succeed in military education. It happened because Young excelled at every assignment despite knowing the system was designed to limit his advancement. It happened because Young rode 497 miles to demonstrate that the obstacles placed in his path were pretexts rather than legitimate concerns. The story of Colonel Charles Young is not just a historical footnote about discrimination in the military. It's a story about the price of being first, the burden of representing an entire race, and the exhausting work of proving humanity to people determined not to see it. It's a story about institutional injustice, about how even the most capable individual could be stopped by systemic racism. And it's a story about perseverance, about refusing to quit even when every institution stands against you. When Charles Young was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in 1923, his tombstone simply read Young. That single word on the reverse side of his marker was perhaps more fitting than any elaborate inscription could have been. In life, Young was always becoming, always striving toward a future that America refused to grant him. In death, his name alone stands as testament to what could have been, what should have been, and what systemic racism prevented from being. The posthumous promotion to Brigadier General in 2022 acknowledged what everyone who knew Charles Young understood during his lifetime. He had earned that rank and more. But acknowledgement, however meaningful, cannot restore the years of service he was denied, the commands he was not allowed to lead, or the opportunities that were taken from him because white officers could not accept the idea of a black general. Charles Young's story matters because it reveals how injustice operates not just through violence or explicit hatred, but through bureaucratic procedures, medical pretexts, and institutional barriers. It matters because it shows how excellence can be acknowledged while still being constrained, and it matters because it demonstrates the human cost of racism, the psychological toll of being exceptional in a system designed to keep you ordinary. 100 years after his death, we can finally call him Brigadier General Charles Young, but we must also remember Colonel Charles Young, the man who rode 497 miles to prove what should never have needed proving, who endured decades of discrimination while maintaining his dignity and dedication, and who paved the way for generations of officers who would follow. His life was indeed a triumph of tragedy, and both parts of that description demand our attention and our remembrance. Wounded 21 times, he fought off 20 Germans with a knife, becoming one of World War I's greatest heroes. France gave him their highest medal. America gave him nothing, discharged him without noting his injuries, and let him die poor and forgotten. This is the story of Henry Johnson. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had no intention of letting black soldiers fight. He wanted American forces kept segregated and autonomous, but he faced a problem. The French army desperately needed reinforcements. They were bleeding to death on the Western Front and begged for American troops. Pershing saw an opportunity. He would lend the French his black regiments. This solved two problems. It gave the French the bodies they needed, and it kept black soldiers separate from white American troops. But Pershing went further. He issued a directive to the French military mission, a document that would later be called Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops. In it, he warned the French that black soldiers were inferior, that they lacked civic and professional conscience, that they were a constant menace. He told the French not to treat these men as equals, not to eat with them, not to shake their hands, not to praise them too highly. White American prejudice was being exported to France. The French largely ignored him. The French had their own colonial troops from Africa and the Caribbean. They had fought alongside them for years. They judged soldiers by one measure: could they fight? The French took the 369th, gave them French rifles and helmets, and sent them to the front lines in the Argonne forest. The Americans had used these men as servants. The French would use them as soldiers. On April 15, 1918, the 369th Infantry arrived at their section of the front line trenches in the Champagne region of northeastern France. They were assigned to Outpost 20, a forward observation position on the edge of the Argonne forest. This was not a safe rear position. This was the sharp end, where German raiding parties came in the night to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, and spread terror. Henry Johnson was 25 years old. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. He'd never fired a shot in anger. He'd received minimal combat training, and now he found himself in one of the most dangerous assignments on the Western Front: sentry duty in no man's land. The night of May 14th was quiet, too quiet. Johnson and Needham Roberts, a 17-year-old from Trenton, New Jersey, had drawn the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. They were stationed at a forward observation post, a small position several hundred yards ahead of the main French line. Behind them were their sleeping comrades. In front of them was darkness, barbed wire, and somewhere beyond that, German soldiers. Around 2 a.m., Johnson heard something, a faint metallic sound. Wire cutters. Someone was cutting through the barbed wire that protected their position. He woke Roberts. They strained their eyes into the darkness. Then they saw them, shapes moving in the night. Grey uniforms, German soldiers, a lot of them. The estimates vary, but most accounts suggest at least 20 German soldiers, possibly as many as 36, were converging on their position. This wasn't random. German intelligence had identified this isolated American outpost. They planned to overwhelm it quickly, capture the 2 sentries, and gather intelligence about American troop positions before anyone could respond. It should have been easy. 2 inexperienced Americans, probably asleep, certainly unprepared. A quick, silent strike. Grab them both. Disappear back into no man's land. Standard raiding party tactics. But Henry Johnson wasn't asleep. He could have stayed silent, could have let them approach, could have surrendered immediately rather than resist overwhelming odds. No one would have blamed him. 2 men against 20 or more? Those aren't odds you fight against. Those are odds that mean you're already dead. Johnson threw his grenades first. The explosions lit up the night, brilliant orange flashes that revealed the Germans closing in from multiple directions. Shrapnel tore through the air. Men screamed. Roberts threw his grenades. The Germans scattered but kept coming. They were professionals, experienced soldiers who'd been fighting since 1914. A few grenades wouldn't stop them. Roberts was hit by grenade fragments in his arm and hip. He went down hard, bleeding, unable to fight. Johnson was alone. He fired his French rifle. 3 rounds. That's all the magazine held. 3 shots. He made them count. The first shot hit a German nearly point blank. The man fell, probably dead before he hit the ground. Another German jumped over his body, pistol raised, coming right at Johnson. There was no time to reload. Johnson swung his rifle like a club. Years of hauling luggage, of physical labor, of hard work had built strength into his arms and shoulders. The wooden stock crashed into the German's skull with sickening force. The man went down screaming. Some accounts say he yelled in English, in a New York accent, cursing Johnson. He was likely an immigrant, maybe someone who'd lived in America before the war, someone who'd been recruited or conscripted by Germany and sent to fight. The war was full of these strange ironies. Germans who spoke English, Americans who spoke German, men who might have lived on the same street in peacetime, trying to kill each other in a French forest. Johnson looked back. His worst fear was realized. 2 Germans had grabbed Roberts and were dragging him toward their own lines. If they captured an American soldier, they could interrogate him, learn about unit positions, command structure, strength, everything. Even if Roberts tried to resist interrogation, they had methods, ways of making soldiers talk, and information from the first American prisoners could be invaluable. Johnson couldn't let that happen. Roberts was his responsibility. More than that, Roberts was his brother in arms. They'd trained together, traveled together, stood watch together. You don't abandon your brother. He had one weapon left, a bolo knife, standard army issue, originally designed for chopping through jungle vegetation in the Philippines. 10 inches of sharpened steel with a heavy-weighted blade. It wasn't meant for combat. It was a tool. But in Johnson's hands, at that moment, it became something else. What happened next has been described by various sources, each trying to capture the savagery of hand-to-hand combat. Johnson buried his knife in one German's head. He disemboweled another. Blood everywhere. The Germans who had grabbed Roberts dropped him and turned to face Johnson. He kept coming, slashing, stabbing, even as a German pistol shot hit him, even as bayonets cut into his body, even as he was wounded again and again. Each slash meant something. Believe me, Johnson would later say with characteristic understatement. There wasn't anything so fine about it. Just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that. But rabbits don't charge into overwhelming odds. Rabbits don't rescue their fallen comrades. Rabbits don't fight for an hour while suffering wound after wound. Johnson's ferocity broke them. The German raiding party had expected to overwhelm 2 isolated, inexperienced American sentries. Instead, they found themselves in a knife fight with someone who refused to stop, refused to fall, refused to die. They could hear French troops stirring behind Johnson's position, responding to the grenade explosions and gunfire. The Germans grabbed their dead and wounded and retreated into the darkness. When French reinforcements arrived minutes later, they found a scene of carnage. Blood everywhere, German equipment scattered across the ground, abandoned weapons, and in the middle of it all, Henry Johnson, still standing, still holding his knife, covered in blood, his own and German. He had been wounded 21 times, knife cuts, bayonet thrusts, bullet wounds, grenade fragments. His left foot was shattered. He had cuts to his head, hands, arms, torso, and legs. Any one of several wounds should have incapacitated him. Together, they should have killed him. The Germans left behind equipment that allowed French intelligence to estimate the size of the raiding party. They found several firearms, including automatic pistols. Based on blood trails, they determined Johnson had killed at least 4 German soldiers and wounded somewhere between 10 and 20 more. The action had lasted roughly 1 hour. 1 hour of sustained hand-to-hand combat. One man, armed eventually with only a knife, holding off more than 20 attackers. The French were astonished. On May 16th, just 1 day after the battle, they awarded both Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. Johnson's citation included the coveted gold palm, given only for extraordinary valor. He was one of the first Americans to receive this distinction. The citation read, "Henry Johnson gave a magnificent example of courage and energy." The French nicknamed him Black Death, a term of respect for his prowess in combat. To them, he was a warrior worthy of their highest honors. The story reached America through an article by journalist Irvin S. Cobb, published in the Saturday Evening Post on August 24, 1918. Cobb titled it, "Young Black Joe," and described the battle in vivid detail. The title itself reflected the casual racism of the era, diminishing Johnson even while praising him. But the content of the article made Johnson famous, at least temporarily. For a brief moment, America celebrated Henry Johnson. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, never one for understatement, called him one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in World War I. The U.S. military immediately saw the propaganda value. They used Johnson's story for recruiting. His image appeared on posters encouraging Black Americans to enlist. His story was told in newspapers and magazines to prove that Black soldiers could fight, could be heroes, could serve with honor. When it served their purposes, when they needed Black bodies to fill quotas and replace casualties, the military celebrated him. "Look at Henry Johnson," they said. "See what a black soldier can do. Come join the fight." But it was conditional. The praise came with unspoken limits. Johnson was allowed to be a hero as long as he remained an exceptional case, an outlier, not representative of what black soldiers could achieve in general. He was allowed to be celebrated as long as he didn't demand that his heroism translate into equal rights. He was allowed to be praised as long as he stayed in his place. The 369th Infantry Regiment spent 191 continuous days on the front lines, longer than any other American unit in the war. Think about that. 191 days of constant danger, constant stress, constant death. They weren't cycled out for rest nearly as often as white American units. They were used hard, spent without regard for casualties, because to the white American command, black soldiers were expendable. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the regiment had earned its nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters. More than 500 members of the regiment received the French Croix de Guerre. The French appreciated their sacrifice. The French honored their service. The French treated them as men. The Americans did not. When the 369th returned home in February 1919, they were greeted as heroes, at least temporarily. New York City gave them a parade up Fifth Avenue. Henry Johnson, promoted to sergeant, led his regiment. Still recovering from his wounds, unable to march because his shattered left foot would never fully heal, he rode in an open car, waving to the crowds, holding a bouquet of lilies that had been handed to him. Thousands lined the streets. For one day, the city celebrated these men. But there was a darker truth hiding beneath the pageantry. The 369th had their own parade because they weren't allowed to join the official victory parade with white American troops. Even in celebration, even after bleeding for their country, even after earning more medals than most white units, they had to be kept separate. The message was clear: you can die for America, but you can't march alongside white Americans. And then came the silence, the deliberate, systematic forgetting. The U.S. Army discharged Henry Johnson shortly after his return. His discharge papers made no mention of his wounds, no mention of his combat service, no mention of the night he held off 24 German soldiers, no mention of his French medals. As far as the official record was concerned, Henry Johnson had served without distinction. He was just another black laborer who'd put on a uniform for a while. He received no disability pay despite his extensive injuries. He received no American medals, no recognition, nothing, no help finding work, no acknowledgement that his service had cost him his health, his ability to earn a living, his future. Why? The simplest answer is racism. But it went deeper than that. It was systematic, deliberate, policy-driven racism. The year 1919 saw a resurgence of white violence against black Americans. The so-called Red Summer saw race riots across the country. White Americans, particularly in the South, were terrified of the idea of black veterans returning home with combat experience, military training, and expectations of equal treatment. There was a deliberate effort to minimize and erase the contributions of black soldiers, to prevent them from using their service as a claim to full citizenship. Henry Johnson had made the mistake of speaking honestly about his experiences. During a promotional speaking tour organized shortly after his return, he was sent to various cities to encourage black Americans to buy war bonds and support the military. But Johnson, perhaps naively, perhaps courageously, told the truth. He detailed the discrimination black troops faced during the war, how they'd been treated as servants rather than soldiers from the moment they arrived in France, how they'd been given inferior equipment, hand-me-down French rifles instead of American weapons, how white American officers had treated them with contempt, had assigned them to labor details instead of combat training, how General Pershing had tried to poison the French against them with his secret directive warning of their supposed inferiority. The tour was quickly shut down. The army didn't want those stories told. They wanted black veterans to be grateful, to be quiet, to accept that their service, while appreciated in the abstract, didn't actually change anything about their status in American society. Johnson returned to Albany. His wounds prevented him from doing physical labor. His left foot, shattered by a German rifle butt, never healed properly. He walked with a limp and couldn't stand for long periods. That eliminated most of the jobs available to him. He couldn't work as a red cap porter anymore, couldn't haul luggage up and down stairs. He couldn't do coal yard work. He couldn't do any of the hard physical labor that had been his means of survival before the war. He applied for jobs, but employers saw a wounded black veteran and wanted nothing to do with him. Some feared he was dangerous, trained in violence, potentially unstable. Others simply didn't want to hire someone who couldn't work at full capacity, and many just didn't want to hire a black man, wounded or not. He struggled to support himself. The Army's refusal to acknowledge his injuries meant he received no disability payments, no pension, no financial help of any kind. The man who had saved American lives, who had stopped a German raid, who had earned France's highest military honor, couldn't pay his rent. His wife, Edna, left him. The exact circumstances vary depending on the source, but the pattern is clear. Poverty destroys marriages. Hopelessness destroys marriages. Watching the man you married waste away, unable to work, unable to provide, unable to get the help he'd earned, that destroys marriages. She had to survive too. Johnson turned to alcohol, not for enjoyment, but for oblivion. To forget what he'd been in France and what he'd become in America. To dull the physical pain that never stopped. To silence the mental anguish of knowing his sacrifice had meant nothing to the country he'd bled for. By the late 1920s, the man who had been celebrated as a hero, whose face had appeared on recruiting posters, whose story had been told in national magazines, was living in poverty, alone, unable to work, forgotten by everyone except a few friends who remembered what he'd done. He was 36 years old, but the war had aged him decades. The wounds, the pain, the poverty, the alcohol, they'd all taken their toll. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was 36 years old. The official cause of death was myocarditis, a heart condition. But the real cause was neglect, poverty, and a nation's willful forgetting. His heart had literally been broken by what America had done to him. For decades, it was believed Henry Johnson had been buried in a pauper's grave in Albany, forgotten and unmarked. Even that indignity was based on incomplete information. In 2001, researchers discovered the truth. Johnson had been buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors in July 1929. Someone, perhaps a sympathetic army officer, perhaps someone who knew his story, had arranged for him to be buried among heroes his family had never known. The information had never reached them. They'd believed for 72 years that he'd been dumped in an unmarked grave. He lay there, in America's most hallowed military cemetery, under the wrong name. His headstone read William Henry Johnson, the name on his birth records that he'd never used in life. Not the name he'd enlisted under, not the name he'd earned his medals under. His grave was visited by no one who knew his story, honored by no one who remembered his sacrifice. He was surrounded by heroes, but treated as if he were just another soldier, no different from anyone else. For more than 70 years, the United States government refused to properly recognize what Henry Johnson had done. They knew the story. The documentation existed. The French citations were in the files. The eyewitness accounts were recorded. The newspaper articles had been published. But acknowledging Johnson meant acknowledging that the Army had failed him, had discriminated against him, had violated its obligations to him. Easier to just let him be forgotten. But some people remembered. Some people fought. In the 1990s, Herman Johnson, who for years believed he was Henry Johnson's son, began a campaign for recognition. Herman himself was a Tuskegee Airman, one of the famed black pilots of World War II who had broken their own barriers and fought their own battles against discrimination. He understood what his supposed father had faced. He understood the systematic denial of recognition, and he decided to do something about it. Herman pushed for the medals his father had been denied. He wrote letters to congressmen, senators, anyone who would listen. He contacted veterans organizations. He researched his father's service record, collecting every document, every newspaper article, every piece of evidence he could find. Later, in 2015, it was discovered through genealogical research that Herman wasn't actually related to Henry by blood. A clerical error or confusion with birth records had led him to believe Henry was his father. But by the time that truth emerged, it didn't matter. That family had adopted Henry's memory and fought for him when no one else would. They'd spent decades advocating for a man who turned out not to be their blood relative, and they didn't regret a moment of it. That's a different kind of heroism. New York Senator Charles Schumer took up the cause in the early 2000s. Schumer saw an injustice that could be corrected. He saw a story that deserved to be told, and he saw a pattern of discrimination that needed to be acknowledged. Albany veterans added their voices. The New York National Guard researched their own history and confirmed Johnson's service and his French medals. Slowly, painfully, the official record began to change. In 1996, President Bill Clinton awarded Henry Johnson a Purple Heart, 77 years after the fact. The Purple Heart is given to soldiers wounded in combat. Johnson had been wounded 21 times in combat. The fact that it took 77 years to give him this medal says everything about how the Army had treated him. In 2002, the U.S. Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor, 83 years after the fact. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism in close combat with an armed enemy. But the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, remained out of reach. The Army's position was that too much time had passed, that the documentation wasn't sufficient, that they couldn't be certain of the details. This was absurd. The French had been certain enough in 1918 to give him their highest honor. Eyewitnesses had testified. Newspaper articles had been published contemporaneously. But the Army claimed they needed more evidence. Senator Schumer didn't give up. His staff dug deeper into the archives. They discovered a letter from General John J. Pershing himself, written shortly after the battle, acknowledging Johnson's extraordinary heroism. They found after-action reports from the 369th Infantry. They found the French citations, the original documents, not just references to them. The documentation was there. It had always been there. The Army had simply chosen to ignore it for nearly a century. Finally, on June 2nd, 2015, 97 years after the battle in the Argonne Forest, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor. The ceremony took place at the White House, in the same room where other heroes had received their medals. By then, Herman Johnson had passed away in 2004. No direct descendants of Henry Johnson could be found. The genealogical research had determined that Henry had no children. The medal was accepted by Command Sergeant Major Louis Wilson of the New York Army National Guard, representing the unit Johnson had served with, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. President Obama's remarks were direct. "We are a nation, a people, who remember our heroes. We never forget their sacrifice, and we believe it's never too late to say thank you." But it had been too late for Henry Johnson. He'd died in poverty 86 years earlier. He'd died forgotten. He'd died believing his country didn't care about his sacrifice. The recognition came when it couldn't matter to him anymore. It came when it couldn't change his life, couldn't give him back the years he'd lost, couldn't undo the poverty and pain and neglect. The Medal of Honor ceremony was attended by military dignitaries, New York politicians, historians, and representatives of the 369th Infantry Regiment. They honored his memory. They praised his service. They acknowledged the injustice. And then they all went home. And Henry Johnson was still dead, still had died penniless, still had been failed by his country. The story of Henry Johnson isn't just about one night in May 1918. It's about how America treats its heroes when those heroes are black. The same pattern repeated itself after World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Black soldiers served with distinction, earned medals for valor, came home to discrimination and denial. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, helped change that. Not immediately, not easily, but they planted seeds. Their service, their sacrifice, their refusal to accept second-class status helped push America toward the civil rights movement. Every black soldier who followed walked paths these men had cleared. Today, Henry Johnson is properly honored. Fort Polk in Louisiana, a U.S. Army base, was renamed Fort Johnson in June 2023. The Sergeant Audie Murphy Club, established to honor exceptional non-commissioned officers, recognizes his standard of service. His story is taught in military history courses. His grave at Arlington National Cemetery is visited and honored. But we should remember what was lost. We should remember that for 97 years, America tried to forget this man, that he died without recognition, without the benefits he'd earned, without the respect he deserved, that it took nearly a century for the truth to be officially acknowledged. On that night in May 1918, Henry Johnson did something extraordinary. Wounded 21 times, armed only with a knife, he held off a superior force and saved his comrade's life. He earned the respect of France. He earned the praise of a former president. He earned medals and honors from a foreign nation that recognized his valor. His own country gave him nothing until he'd been dead for 67 years. The men of the 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, spent 191 days on the front lines. They fought with courage. They earned hundreds of medals from France, and when they came home, they were told to go back to being second-class citizens, to forget what they'd proven, to accept their place. The French had treated them as men. America wanted them to go back to being boys, to being servants, to being invisible. Henry Johnson couldn't forget. He'd been something more in France. He'd been a soldier, a warrior, a man respected for what he could do rather than judged by the color of his skin. In France, when he walked down the street in his uniform with his Croix de Guerre on his chest, people saluted him. French citizens thanked him. French soldiers treated him as a comrade. For maybe the first time in his life, he'd been seen as a man, fully human, worthy of respect. Coming back to an America that wanted to pretend none of that had happened destroyed him. It wasn't just the physical wounds, though those were devastating enough. It was the psychological wound of being told that his sacrifice didn't matter, that his heroism was an inconvenience, that he should be grateful just to be allowed to exist in a country he'd nearly died defending. In 2018, on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Henry Johnson, ceremonies were held in France and America. Veterans and historians gathered to honor his memory. French officials attended, acknowledging that their nation had recognized his valor a century ago, while America had failed him. The New York State Military Museum held special events. His story was finally being told accurately, completely, without the diminishment and dismissal that had characterized earlier tellings. The French ceremonies were particularly moving. French citizens and officials stood in the Argonne Forest, near where Johnson had fought, and honored his memory. They hadn't forgotten. They'd never forgotten. To them, Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters were heroes, full stop. No qualifications, no asterisks, just heroes. But the question remains, how many other Henry Johnsons are there? How many soldiers performed acts of extraordinary valor, earned the respect of their comrades and their enemies, and then had their stories deliberately erased because of the color of their skin? How many died forgotten, their sacrifice unrecognized, their names lost to history? The answer is hundreds, thousands. The documentation exists. Historians have found the records. Medal of Honor recommendations that were denied. Valor citations that were downgraded or disappeared. Black soldiers who saved white soldiers' lives but received no recognition because acknowledging them would mean treating them as equals. The systematic denial of recognition to black soldiers wasn't an accident. It was policy. The U.S. Army's official citation for Henry Johnson's Medal of Honor reads, "Private Henry Johnson distinguished himself by extraordinary acts of heroism at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a member of Company C, 369 Infantry Regiment, 93rd Infantry Division, American Expeditionary Forces on May the 15th, 1918, during combat operations against the enemy on the front lines of the Western Front in France. It goes on to detail his actions, his wounds, his rescue of his fellow soldier. It acknowledges what the French had recognized in 1918. It says what should have been said in 1919. Every word is true. Every word is accurate. And every word came 97 years too late. Those words, written in 2015, couldn't bring Henry Johnson back, couldn't give him the life he deserved, couldn't give him the medical care he needed, couldn't give him the ability to work and support himself, couldn't give him back his marriage, couldn't give him back his health, couldn't undo 36 years of struggle and 86 years of obscurity. They're important words, necessary words. Words that needed to be said, but they came 97 years too late to matter to the man they honored. Henry Johnson died believing his country had forgotten him, and he was right. For most of a century, America chose to forget, chose to erase, chose to pretend that his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of thousands of black soldiers like him, didn't matter as much as the sacrifice of white soldiers. That their heroism was somehow less worthy of recognition, that their wounds were less deserving of treatment, that their service was less valuable. Today we remember, not because it was easy, not because it came naturally, not because America's institutions spontaneously decided to do the right thing, but because people like Herman Johnson, like Senator Schumer, like the veterans of the 369, like historians and activists and ordinary citizens who cared about justice, refused to let the story die. They fought for decades to make America acknowledge what it had tried to forget. They wouldn't give up. They wouldn't be silent. They demanded that the truth be told. The story of Henry Johnson isn't a feel-good tale of eventual justice. It's a tragedy. A man who gave everything, received nothing, and died broken. The medals that came later, the recognition that finally arrived, the honors that were posthumously bestowed, they don't change that. They can't undo what was done to him. They can't give him back his life. They can't repair the damage. They're acknowledgments of guilt, admissions that America failed him, but they're not redemption. But they can remind us. They can make sure that his story and the stories of the Harlem Hellfighters remain part of our history, not hidden, not erased, not forgotten again. They can serve as a warning about what happens when we allow discrimination and prejudice to override justice and honor. They can teach us that the fight for recognition, for respect, for basic human dignity is never finished, because there are always people and institutions that would prefer to forget uncomfortable truths. On the night of May 15th, 1918, a 5'4" railroad porter from Albany, New York, became one of the bravest soldiers America ever produced. He fought for an hour with 21 wounds in his body. He refused to quit. He refused to surrender. He refused to abandon his comrade. He stopped a German raid that could have compromised American positions. He earned the respect of the French army. He earned France's highest military honor. He earned his place among history's greatest warriors. And then he came home to a country that pretended it had never happened, that discharged him without acknowledgement, that denied him medical care, that let him struggle in poverty, that let him die alone and forgotten at age 36. That's the real story of Henry Johnson. Not just what he did in the Argonne Forest, but what America did to him afterward. Both parts matter. Both parts are true. Both parts need to be remembered, because remembering what he did honors his courage. But remembering what was done to him honors the truth, and without truth, honor means nothing. He deserved better. He earned better. He should have received better. The fact that recognition finally came, 97 years late, doesn't change the fundamental injustice of his story. It acknowledges it, it admits it, but it doesn't fix it. Nothing can fix it. Henry Johnson is dead. He died poor. He died forgotten. And all the medals and ceremonies and honors in the world can't change that. What we can do is remember. Remember his courage. Remember his sacrifice. And remember what his country did to him, so we can try to do better for the soldiers who serve today. So we can recognize the ongoing patterns of discrimination that still affect veterans, especially veterans of color. So we can acknowledge that the fight for equal recognition and equal treatment is still being waged, more than a century after Henry Johnson fought his battle in the Argonne Forest. That's what we owe him. Not just remembrance of his heroism, but recognition of the injustice. Not just celebration of what he did, but acknowledgement of what was done to him. Both truths, together always. After his white captain abandoned him, Vernon Baker fought on alone against an entire German line. He single-handedly saved his men and broke the enemy. His reward was America ignoring him for 52 years. December 17th, 1919. Cheyenne, Wyoming, a city of 13,000 souls, where exactly 12 black families tried to carve out existence in a state that had never been kind to their presence. In a modest home on the edge of town, Dora and Joseph Baker welcomed their grandson Vernon into a world that had just claimed his parents. 4 years old, orphaned by a car accident that left him and his 2 sisters with only their grandparents' calloused hands to guide them. Joseph Baker was a railroad man, chief brakeman for the Union Pacific. His hands bore the scars of steel and steam, his back bent from decades of labor that white men considered beneath them, but necessary enough to pay a black man poverty wages to perform. He taught young Vernon to shoot, to hunt, to feed the family when money ran short. But more than that, he taught him something that would carry the boy through hell itself. If you want to live, boy, learn how to conform. It was 1941. Vernon Baker stood outside a recruiting office in Cheyenne, 21 years old, desperate to escape the grinding poverty of railroad work that had broken his grandfather. The recruiter looked him up and down with the casual contempt reserved for men whose skin marked them as less than human. "We ain't got no quotas for you people." Baker walked away, but he came back. 2 months later. Different recruiter. Same prejudice, but this time buried under bureaucratic necessity. The army needed bodies, even black ones. Baker requested quartermaster duty, supply sergeant work. Safe, clean, away from the fighting. "You'll take infantry," the recruiter said. "You'll take what we give you." Baker signed anyway. He didn't say anything because he was going to get in. What Vernon Baker couldn't have known as he boarded that segregated train to Camp Walters, Texas, was that he had just volunteered to fight 2 wars simultaneously. One against fascism abroad, one against fascism at home, and in the Jim Crow South of 1941, the Second War would prove far more vicious than anything the Germans could devise. The bus driver's voice cut through the humid Texas air like a whip crack. "Hey, get to the back of the bus where you belong." Baker's fist was halfway to the driver's face when an old black man grabbed his arm, led him to the rear, explained, in the weary tones of a man who had made this same walk 1,000 times, the rules of Southern living. The rules that said a man in uniform, a man who volunteered to die for his country, couldn't sit in the front third of a bus. "Segregation hit me full in the face," Baker would later recall. "I don't regret joining the army. I do regret being assigned to places like Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. At Fort Huachuca, Arizona, home to the 375th Infantry Regiment, Baker discovered that the enemy wore multiple uniforms. 3 black enlisted men, trapped in menial positions for years, resenting his rapid advancement, jumped him one night in the dark. They whipped me up because I was the smart individual. But the cruelest insult came from the institution itself. German prisoners of war, men who had fought to exterminate entire races, men whose hands were stained with the blood of millions, could walk through the front entrance of the officers' club at Fort Huachuca. Lieutenant Vernon Baker, American officer, trained leader of men, could not. The Germans got better treatment than the Americans defending them. In October 1942, Baker found himself summoned to regimental headquarters. He thought he was in trouble. Instead, a colonel pushed papers across the desk. Officer candidate school. Baker didn't want to go. As a supply sergeant, he had it made. Easy duty, but the army had other plans. At Fort Benning, Georgia, one officer explained the mathematics of expendability to the class of black officer candidates. "We're making a lot of second lieutenants. Want to know why? because second lieutenants are expendable. On January 11th, 1943, Vernon Baker became a second lieutenant in the United States Army. 5 months before Pearl Harbor, no black soldiers had been allowed in combat roles. Now, as casualties mounted and white replacement pools dried up, the Army grudgingly activated 2 all-black divisions. Baker was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, a unit with a proud history stretching back to the Indian Wars, now commanded almost entirely by white Southern officers who considered their men inherently inferior, inherently cowardly, inherently incapable of combat. Captain John Runyon arrived at Baker's unit in March 1945, white, Southern, in command of men he believed couldn't fight. It was a combination that would prove nearly fatal. July 28, 1944, the SS Mariposa pulled into Naples Harbor, carrying 7,000 men of the 371st Infantry Regiment. The entire ship was black, which meant no segregation aboard. Small mercies in a segregated war. They had to walk across gangplanks laid over sunken ships in the shallow harbor to reach Italian soil. Beyond Naples lay the Gothic Line. The Gothic Line. 200 miles of German fortifications woven into the Apennine Mountains. Machine gun nests so well camouflaged that aerial spotters couldn't find them. Artillery positions carved into medieval castles. Bunkers that shrugged off bombs and shells. The Germans had turned northern Italy into a graveyard, and the 92nd Infantry Division was ordered to break through. Baker learned to fight at night. Patrols through the darkness, mapping German positions, learning the terrain. On October 8, 1944, his luck ran out. A night patrol attacking a German-held house. 3 men down immediately. Baker wounded in the arm. 2 months in the 64th General Hospital in Pisa while the fighting continued without him. When he returned in December, he was the senior officer in his unit, until Captain Runyon and 2 other white officers arrived. The pattern was clear. Black soldiers could fight. Black soldiers could die. But black soldiers couldn't be trusted to lead. Castle Aginolfi, a 15th century fortress perched on a hill east of the coastal highway, commanding a view of the entire western Gothic line. 3 previous attempts to take it had ended in slaughter. The castle's slopes were ringed with stone and mortar walls that easily repelled artillery. The surrounding mountains held German guns in interlocking fields of fire. American units had been fed into this meat grinder for months, achieving nothing but mounting casualties. April 5th, 1945, 5 a.m. Before dawn, Baker led his weapons platoon toward Castle Aginolfi, with Company C's 3 rifle platoons. 70% of his men were replacements with no combat experience. Boys barely out of training, assigned to a doomed assault because someone in headquarters had decided the 92nd Division wasn't really combat effective anyway. What did it matter if these particular soldiers died trying? Baker's platoon moved faster than the rest of the company. Within 2 hours, he and about 25 men had reached a draw 250 yards from the castle, close enough to see the German positions, close enough to die. He was scouting for a machine gun position when he noticed 2 cylindrical objects protruding from a slit in a mound at the edge of the hill. Observation scopes. Germans directing fire on his men. Baker crawled up under the opening, stuck his rifle through the slit, and emptied an entire clip. 2 Germans dead before they understood what was happening. Moving forward, Baker stumbled on a well-camouflaged machine gun nest. The crew was eating breakfast. He shot and killed both men before they could reach their weapon. Captain Runyon appeared. A German soldier hurled a grenade that struck Runyon's helmet but failed to explode. Baker shot the German twice as he tried to flee. But something was wrong with Runyon, something beyond the near miss. His eyes held the glassy sheen of panic, the look of a man discovering he wasn't as brave as he'd believed. Baker continued alone, down into a ravine. More German positions. He found a concealed dugout, blasted the entrance open with a grenade, shot 1 German who emerged, threw another grenade inside, and entered firing his submachine gun. 2 more Germans dead. By now, the Germans had spotted the American advance. Mortar fire began to fall. Machine guns opened up. Men screamed. Boys who had been farmers and factory workers 3 months ago were torn apart by steel and fire. The casualties mounted. Out of 25 men, 2/3 were dead or wounded. Baker climbed out of the drawer and found Runyon. The captain was overcome by fear. "I'm going for reinforcements," Runyon said. "Cover my withdrawal." Baker knew in that moment that Runyon wasn't coming back, that his captain was abandoning him and his men to die on this Italian hillside, that the white officer commanding black soldiers had decided, when confronted with actual danger, that these men weren't worth dying beside. Runyon took the radio man, the only link to artillery support, and disappeared. Baker was left with 8 men and almost no ammunition. The German mortars continued to fall. A German weapons platoon, disguised as medics, opened fire. Baker made the hardest decision of his life. "We withdraw. I want some of you to stay alive." His men wanted to stay and fight, but Baker ordered the retreat. He would cover them. Under constant fire, Baker crawled forward and destroyed 2 more machine gun nests with grenades, clearing a path for his remaining men to reach safety. 19 men died on that hill. 19 men Baker led up that mountain in the pre-dawn darkness. When he returned to regimental headquarters to turn in their dog tags, Colonel Raymond Sherman was waiting. "Where's your steel helmet, Lieutenant?" That was what mattered to the regimental commander. Not the 19 dead, not the mission accomplished despite being abandoned by the company commander, not the extraordinary courage of men fighting without support. The steel helmet. Baker stood there, exhausted, covered in the blood and dirt of battle, and received a reprimand for uniform violations. The next night, Baker volunteered to lead a battalion advance through enemy minefields and heavy fire back toward Castle Aginolfi. The Germans had withdrawn. By April 10th, the 92nd Division entered Massa. The Gothic line was broken. Germany would surrender within a month. Captain Runyon recommended Baker for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest honor for valor. Baker's fellow soldiers believed it should have been the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was never forwarded to Washington, and Baker was never told it had even been considered. On July 4th, 1945, Baker received his Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony in Viareggio. The white commanders who had abandoned their men, who had failed in their basic duty to support the soldiers under their command, received lesser decorations that day, but they occupied the place of honor in the ceremony. The black lieutenant who had saved the mission stood in the back. Baker remained in Italy on occupation duty until February 1947. He re-enlisted, fought in the Korean War. In 1951, after President Truman's desegregation order took effect, Baker became one of the first black officers to command an all-white company. 20 years after being told he belonged in the back of the bus, he led white soldiers who called him Sir. He retired in 1968 after 27 years of service, worked for the Red Cross for more than 20 years, married Heidi Pavlik, a white woman, in 1993. In 1941, that interracial relationship would have gotten him beaten or killed in the South. 52 years later, they were welcomed at the White House. Because in the early 1990s, the Department of Defense had a problem. Of the more than 400 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not a single one had gone to a black soldier. Not one, out of 1.2 million black Americans who served. Not one was considered brave enough, heroic enough, worthy enough for the nation's highest honor. The silence was deafening, and the lie was obvious. In 1993, under pressure from the Congressional Black Caucus, the Army commissioned a study. They asked Shaw University, a historically black college in Raleigh, North Carolina, to determine if there had been racial disparity in how Medals of Honor were awarded during World War II. The study was led by Daniel Gibran, a political science professor whose specialty was international relations, not military history. But when he was told about the project, he was intrigued. "I knew this study would yield tangible results, and that something would be done." What Gibran found was what everyone already knew, but no one in power wanted to admit: systematic racial discrimination. The study's conclusion was unambiguous. It was simply racism. Segregation was inherently bigoted. The political climate and army practices during the war guaranteed that no black soldier would receive the military's top award. Not because they weren't brave enough, not because they didn't perform heroic acts, but because their skin was the wrong color. The Shaw team reviewed records of black soldiers who had received recognitions below the Medal of Honor. They identified soldiers whose deeds were comparable to those of white men who had received the highest honor. The standard wasn't different. The results were, after an exhaustive review, the team recommended 10 black soldiers for the Medal of Honor. The Army's Board of General Officers reviewed the cases and selected 7. Sergeant Reuben Rivers, Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, Jr., First Lieutenant Charles Thomas, Private First Class Willie James, Jr., Private George Watson, First Lieutenant John Fox, and First Lieutenant Vernon Baker. By 1997, Baker was the only one still alive, January 13th, 1997. The East Room of the White House. The Marine Corps band played God Bless America. Vernon Baker, 77 years old, entered to a standing ovation. Every member of President Clinton's cabinet was present. Idaho Senators Larry Craig and Dirk Kempthorne, retired General Colin Powell, General John Shalikashvili, the widows and families of the 6 men being honored posthumously. President Clinton stood beneath the glistening chandeliers where, exactly 52 years earlier to the day, President Harry Truman had presented 28 World War II veterans with the Medal of Honor. Truman had described those men as a great cross-section of the United States. No, Clinton said. Today we fill the gap in that picture and give a group of heroes who also loved peace but adapted themselves to war, the tribute that has always been their due. Clinton recounted their stories. Reuben Rivers, who refused evacuation after his tank hit a mine, took command of another tank and fought until he was killed. Edward Carter, shot 5 times while crossing an open field in Germany, who killed 6 German soldiers trying to capture him and brought 2 prisoners back for interrogation. Charles Thomas, wounded repeatedly while helping his men find cover, refusing evacuation until he ensured they could return fire effectively. Willie James, pinned down for an hour, who planned a counterattack and was killed going to the aid of his wounded platoon leader. George Watson, who repeatedly pulled men from the water after their ship was bombed until exhaustion pulled him under. John Fox, who called artillery fire onto his own position to stop a German assault, knowing it would kill him. And Vernon Baker. Clinton quoted Baker's personal creed, the words that had carried him through battle and through decades of a nation's ingratitude. Give respect before you expect it. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Remember the mission. Set the example. Keep going. Those are words for all of us, Clinton added. The president draped the Medal of Honor around Baker's neck. The pale blue ribbon, the 5-pointed star. Baker stood erect and proud. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't move to wipe them away. Reporters asked him later what he was thinking during the ceremony. I was thinking about what was going on up on the hill that day. The 19 men, the men he left behind. The men who should have been standing beside him but never got the chance to grow old, to be honored, to be remembered. The only thing that I can say to those that are not here with me is, thank you, fellas, well done. I was an angry young man. We were all angry. But we had a job to do, and we did it. Someone asked how he felt about receiving the honor 50 years late. Baker's response cut through the celebration like a knife. I'm angry. If I was worthy of receiving the Medal of Honor in 1945, I should have received it then. But receiving the honor now, I insert those that every black soldier that fought in the Second World War has been vindicated. Everyone. The ceremonies continued. The Pentagon, the Hall of Heroes. Vernon Baker's name joined approximately 3,400 other Medal of Honor recipients on wood-paneled walls. One of the most touching moments came when Baker spoke privately with General Robert Foley, one of only 2 Medal of Honor winners on active duty. 2 men, 2 wars, 2 eras. One recognition, finally, of what should have been obvious all along. Black soldiers were brave. Black soldiers were heroic. Black soldiers deserved honor. Vernon Baker died on July 13, 2010, at his home in St. Mary's, Idaho, after a long battle with cancer. He was 90 years old. His wife Heidi and family members were by his side. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. In his memoir, Lasting Valor, Baker reflected on his experiences. He never stopped thinking about the 19 men on that hill, never stopped wondering if he could have saved them, never stopped mourning the waste of young lives in a war that freed Europe while leaving Black Americans in chains at home. But he also never stopped believing in the mission, never stopped setting the example, never stopped moving forward. "I'm not a hero," he said repeatedly. "The real heroes were the 19 men I left on the hill that day." But history disagrees. Vernon Baker was a hero, not despite the racism he faced, but in defiance of it. He volunteered to serve a nation that denied him basic rights. He led men into battle when his own commanders abandoned him. He fought with extraordinary courage in a war against fascism while his own country practiced a different form of the same disease. And when, 52 years later, his nation finally acknowledged what it had done, Baker stood in the White House and accepted the Medal of Honor, not for himself, but for every black soldier who fought in the Second World War, everyone who was told they weren't good enough, everyone who was denied recognition, everyone who died defending freedom they were not allowed to enjoy. The Shaw University study proved what everyone already knew. It was simply racism. The absence of Black Medal of Honor recipients from World War II wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. It was policy. Unwritten, unacknowledged, but as real as the segregated barracks and the back-of-the-bus rules and the German prisoners who got better treatment than American soldiers. 7 men received justice in 1997. 7 out of 1.2 million, and only 1 lived to see it. Vernon Baker, the black hero. America tried to forget. The soldier who did his job despite everything his country threw at him. The man who stood at 5 feet 5 inches and 140 pounds, but carried the weight of an entire generation's broken promises up an Italian hillside in the pre-dawn darkness. On April 5, 1945, Vernon Baker destroyed 3 machine gun nests, 2 observation posts, and a dugout. He killed 9 German soldiers. He covered his men's retreat while under constant fire. He volunteered the next night to lead another advance through minefields. For 52 years, America's answer was a Distinguished Service Cross and silence. The Medal of Honor that Vernon Baker finally received in 1997 wasn't just his. It belonged to Sergeant Henry Johnson, who saved his entire unit in World War I but died in poverty, forgotten. It belonged to Doris Miller, who shot down Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor but was sent back to mess duty. It belonged to the Port Chicago 50, convicted of mutiny for refusing to load ammunition without safety equipment after an explosion killed 320 men. It belonged to the Wereth 11, massacred by the SS during the Battle of the Bulge, their deaths ignored for decades. It belonged to every black soldier who fought for a country that wouldn't fight for them. Vernon Baker's Medal of Honor certificate hangs in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Below it is a quote from an unnamed source, taken from a 1945 interrogation report. The real story is not what Vernon Baker did on one day in April 1945. The real story is what America did for the next 52 years. Nothing. In 1997, President Clinton said, "They were denied the nation's highest honor, but their deeds could not be denied." But the deeds were denied for half a century, while the men who performed them grew old, died, and were forgotten, while their children and grandchildren inherited a nation that told them their fathers' and grandfathers' sacrifices didn't matter enough to remember. Vernon Baker never forgot the 19 men he left on that hill. America forgot all of them, forgot them so thoroughly that it took a university study, congressional pressure, and 52 years to admit the obvious truth. That's the story of Vernon Baker. Not just a hero, a witness, a living testament to what America did to the men who saved it, and a reminder that when we finally, belatedly, do the right thing, we must acknowledge exactly how long we waited and why. Give respect before you expect it. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Remember the mission. Set the example. Keep going. Vernon Baker kept going. Through racism, through combat, through 52 years of silence. He kept going until his country, finally, reluctantly, could no longer ignore what he had done. The black hero. You don't remember, died at 90, honored at last, mourned properly, buried with the respect he always deserved. But for most of his life, Vernon Baker was exactly what the title of this story says. Forgotten, ignored, erased from the history he helped write, until 7 black soldiers received justice from a White House that had denied it for half a century, until researchers at a black university proved what everyone already knew, until one man, standing in the East Room with tears streaming down his face, accepted an honor that should have been automatic, but took a lifetime to arrive. Vernon Baker. Remember the name. Remember the man. Remember what America did. And remember what it took to make America remember. Give respect before you expect it. December 7th, 1941, 7:55 in the morning. 22-year-old Doris Miller was below deck on the USS West Virginia, collecting soiled laundry. In less than 15 minutes, he would become one of the most celebrated heroes of World War II. But first, the Navy had to figure out how to admit he existed. His name was Doris, not Dory, Doris. The midwife who delivered him on October the 12th, 1919 in Waco, Texas, had been convinced the baby would be a girl. When Connery and Henrietta Miller's 3rd son arrived instead, the name stuck. According to his mother, Doris was never ashamed of it. He wore it with the same quiet confidence that would one day define his actions under fire. The Miller family worked a small sharecropping farm just outside Waco in Spiegelville. 28 acres of hard Texas earth, where 4 sons learned what labor meant before they learned to read. Doris and his brothers worked the cotton and corn fields from dawn until dark, helping their parents scratch out an existence during the Depression years, when hope came in smaller portions than hunger. By the time Doris reached high school, he stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds. The football coach at A.J. Moore High School took one look at him and saw a fullback. Doris became a star player, using the same physical power that he'd developed hauling crops and working the fields. But there were no college scouts waiting for young black men from sharecropping families in 1930s Texas. There were only more fields to work, more seasons of watching opportunities pass by like distant trains you weren't allowed to board. Doris dropped out of school during 8th grade. He'd repeated the year once due to poor performance, and the mathematics of survival dictated a different path. He took a job as a short-order cook at a local diner, adding his wages to the family's income. He hunted small game with a .22 rifle, becoming an excellent marksman. He completed a correspondence course in taxidermy. He tried to join the Civilian Conservation Corps and was rejected. On September 16, 1939, less than a month before his 20th birthday, Doris Miller walked into the Naval Recruiting Station in Dallas, Texas, and enlisted for a 6-year term. The Navy offered a chance to see the world beyond Waco, and it offered steady money he could send home to his family. What it didn't offer was opportunity. The United States Navy in 1939 had essentially one job available for black men: mess attendant. Since 1919, the Navy had banned black enlistments entirely. When they finally reopened recruitment in 1932, they created a simple system. Black sailors would cook, clean, serve food, and do laundry for white officers. They would be, in the words of one historian, personal servants. They would sleep separately, eat separately, and exist in a segregated world within the segregated Navy. This wasn't accident or oversight. This was policy, deliberate and carefully maintained. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, would later state it explicitly. The policy of limiting black sailors to the messman branch was adopted to meet the best interests of general ship efficiency. Translation: white officers and sailors refused to take orders from black men, refused to serve alongside them as equals, and the Navy chose to accommodate that refusal rather than challenge it. Doris Miller knew all this when he signed his enlistment papers. He knew it when he reported to Naval Training Station in Norfolk, Virginia, on September 19, 1939. He knew it when he completed training and was assigned as a mess attendant 3rd class to the ammunition ship USS Pyro. He'd grown up in Texas. He understood exactly what opportunities a black man could expect in 1939 America, and he made his peace with it because the alternative was staying in Waco watching his family struggle. On January 2, 1940, Miller transferred to the battleship USS West Virginia. The Colorado-class battleship, commissioned in 1923, was one of the most powerful warships in the Pacific Fleet. For a farm boy from Texas who'd never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, the West Virginia must have seemed impossibly massive. Over 600 feet long, displacing more than 32,000 tons, armed with 8 16-inch guns that could throw a shell the weight of a small car more than 20 miles. Miller's duties hadn't changed. He cooked, he cleaned, he served meals to officers, he collected laundry. But on the West Virginia, something else happened. Miller, who'd played football and worked hard labor his entire life, discovered the ship's boxing program. He entered the heavyweight division and became the ship's boxing champion. For the first time in his Navy career, his fellow sailors knew his name for something other than the color of his skin. The Navy didn't train mess attendants on weapons. They weren't supposed to need weapons training. Their battle station during combat wasn't manning guns or managing damage control. Their battle station was serving officers and keeping the galley operational. The Navy's reasoning was simple and ugly. Black men weren't intelligent enough or trustworthy enough to handle complex weapon systems. They could cook. That was enough. By late 1941, tensions with Japan had reached a breaking point. President Roosevelt had moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, hoping the presence of American naval power would discourage Japanese aggression. The opposite happened. Japanese military planners, recognizing that war with the United States was inevitable if they continued their expansion in Southeast Asia, began detailed planning for a preemptive strike that would cripple the Pacific Fleet before America could respond. The USS West Virginia arrived at Pearl Harbor and took up her mooring along Battleship Row, the line of battleships anchored along the southeast shore of Ford Island. She was moored outboard of the USS Tennessee, with the USS Arizona astern and the USS Oklahoma ahead. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the West Virginia had a complement of 1,541 men. Doris Miller was doing laundry. It was Sunday morning, just before 8 a.m. Miller had risen early to begin collecting soiled laundry, one of his regular duties. The ship was quiet, the crew either sleeping late or preparing for church services. The Hawaiian sun was already warm, promising another perfect December day in paradise. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. 183 planes, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, descended on the unprepared American fleet. The USS West Virginia, moored on the outboard side of Battleship Row with her port side exposed to the harbor, became an immediate target. Miller heard the general quarters alarm. He heard explosions. He heard men shouting. He abandoned the laundry and ran toward his assigned battle station, only to find it had been destroyed by one of the first torpedo hits. The West Virginia was already listing to port, already flooding, already dying. What happened next would make Doris Miller famous. What happened next would also reveal exactly how the U.S. Navy viewed black sailors in 1941. Because Miller's heroism that morning wasn't just about fighting the Japanese, it was about fighting to be recognized as fully human by his own government. Miller ran up to the main deck and found chaos. The West Virginia had been hit by multiple torpedoes in rapid succession. Water was pouring into the ship with the force of a flash flood. The battleship was listing so severely that men could barely keep their footing on the oil-slicked deck. Japanese planes screamed overhead, their machine guns raking the superstructure. Bombs were falling. The air smelled of smoke, burning oil, and blood. Captain Mervyn S. Bennion, the ship's commanding officer, stood on the bridge trying to control the disaster. Bennion was a 35-year veteran of the Navy. a respected officer who'd taken command of the West Virginia just 5 months earlier. He was also a devout member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who'd been preparing to attend church services when the attack began. A bomb struck the nearby USS Tennessee. The explosion sent shrapnel flying across the narrow gap between the two battleships. Fragments of steel tore into Captain Bennion's abdomen and spine. The injuries were catastrophic. Bennion collapsed on the bridge, his intestines exposed, unable to move his legs. Miller arrived on the bridge and was ordered to help move the captain to safety. Along with Lieutenant D.C. Johnson and another sailor, Miller tried to carry the mortally wounded Bennion away from the exposed position. But Bennion, even as he bled to death, refused to leave his post. He ordered the men to leave him alone and continue fighting the ship. Think about that moment. Captain Bennion, a white officer from Utah, lying on the deck with mortal wounds, giving orders to Doris Miller, a black mess attendant from Texas who wasn't supposed to be on the bridge at all. Two men separated by every social barrier 1941 America could construct, united by duty and the understanding that the ship was dying and men needed saving. Miller and the others stayed with Bennion as long as they could, applying a simple dressing to the terrible wounds, trying to make him comfortable. But the captain was right. There were other men who needed help, men who might survive if someone acted quickly. Miller left the captain and went to work pulling wounded sailors away from the fires and explosions, using his massive strength to drag men through oil and water to relative safety. Then someone, and history hasn't definitively recorded who, ordered Miller to man an anti-aircraft gun. The gun was a Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun, one of two mounted on the bridge. It was a weapon Miller had never been trained to operate. The Navy didn't train black sailors on machine guns. Black sailors weren't supposed to touch the weapons. But the trained gunners were dead or wounded. Japanese planes were attacking the ship, and someone needed to fight back. Miller took position behind the gun. Later, when asked how he knew what to do, Miller would say something that perfectly captured both his competence and the absurdity of the Navy's policies. It wasn't hard. I just pulled the trigger, and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns. He had watched, because of course he had watched. Miller had spent months aboard the West Virginia seeing white sailors train with weapons he wasn't allowed to touch. He'd watched them load the ammunition, watched them charge the weapons, watched them practice tracking targets. And now, with the ship sinking and planes attacking, Miller proved what everyone who believed in segregation had always claimed was impossible. A black man could not only operate a complex weapon, he could operate it effectively in combat without any formal training. Miller opened fire on the attacking Japanese aircraft. For approximately 15 minutes, he poured .50 caliber rounds into the sky, tracking the fast-moving planes, leading his targets, adjusting his aim. The exact number of planes he hit is disputed. Navy records officially credit him with shooting down one aircraft. Miller himself and other witnesses claimed he downed between 4 and 6 planes. What isn't disputed is that he kept firing until the gun ran out of ammunition. Only then did he leave his post, only after the ammunition was exhausted and he was ordered to abandon ship. The USS West Virginia had been hit by at least 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The counterflooding that Miller and others had helped implement kept the ship from capsizing, but she settled to the bottom of Pearl Harbor in 40 feet of water, resting upright in the mud. Of the ship's 1,541 men, 106 were killed. Captain Mervyn S. Bennion was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for refusing to leave his post despite mortal wounds. Doris Miller swam to Ford Island with other survivors and immediately began helping rescue sailors from the water. Even after leaving his ship, even after fighting for 15 minutes at a gun he wasn't supposed to touch, he continued pulling men to safety. And then the Navy tried to make him disappear. The initial reports from Pearl Harbor mentioned an unnamed Negro messman who had manned a machine gun during the attack. That was it. No name, just Negro messman, as if Miller's race was more important than his identity, as if he was interchangeable with any other black sailor aboard any other ship. This wasn't an oversight. This was policy. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who adamantly opposed black sailors serving in combat roles, was reluctant to acknowledge that a mess attendant had performed heroically. To acknowledge Miller by name would be to admit that the Navy's segregation policies were built on lies. It would be to admit that black sailors were just as capable as white sailors if given the opportunity. So the Navy said nothing. For months, as white heroes from Pearl Harbor were identified, celebrated, and promoted, Miller remained an unnamed Negro messman. The black press wouldn't accept it. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in America, began investigating. They spent $7,000, an enormous sum in 1942, tracking down the identity of the unnamed sailor. In March 1942, the Courier broke the story. The hero was Doris Miller of Waco, Texas, mess attendant second class. Suddenly, Miller had a name, and with a name came pressure. Senator James Meade of New York introduced a Senate bill to award Miller the Medal of Honor. Representative John Dingell, Sr. of Michigan, introduced a matching House bill. The NAACP demanded recognition. Black organizations across the country launched petition campaigns. The pressure built until even Secretary Knox, who opposed any honor for Miller, couldn't ignore it. On April 1, 1942, Knox issued an official commendation for Miller. It was the minimum he could do without being accused of outright racism. But Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, pushed for more. Nimitz, a fellow Texan who'd heard about Miller's actions from multiple sources, insisted on proper recognition. On May 11th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the Navy Cross for Miller. It was the Navy's third highest decoration for valor at the time. On May 27, 1942, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise anchored at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz personally pinned the Navy Cross on Doris Miller's uniform. Nimitz's comments that day were both celebratory and revealing. This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts, a member of his race. Even in recognition, the segregation remained. Even in honoring Miller's courage, Nimitz had to acknowledge that the Navy viewed him first as black and second as a sailor. Miller became the first African American to receive the Navy Cross. But many people, including sailors and officers who'd witnessed his actions, believed he deserved more. They believed Miller's heroism warranted the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Secretary Knox disagreed. In an April 9, 1942 letter to the House Committee on Naval Affairs, Knox argued against awarding Miller the Medal of Honor. His reasoning was clear. Acknowledging a black sailor as America's greatest hero would undermine the Navy's segregation policies. It would force uncomfortable questions about why such a capable man was restricted to serving meals and collecting laundry. No black sailor, soldier, or Marine received the Medal of Honor during World War II. Not one, not Doris Miller, despite his documented heroism at Pearl Harbor. Not the thousands of black soldiers who fought and died from Normandy to Okinawa. The highest award their nation could bestow was apparently reserved for white heroes only. But Miller's story had already escaped the Navy's control. The black press made him a symbol of the Double Vive campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against Jim Crow at home. Here was living proof that black Americans could fight, could lead, could sacrifice as much as anyone. The segregation policies couldn't survive that truth indefinitely. The Pittsburgh Courier kept pushing. In June 1942, they demanded that Miller be sent home on a war bond tour, like white heroes were doing. Let him perform the same service among his people that the white heroes are performing among their people, the paper wrote. The Navy resisted for months. Miller remained assigned to the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, still serving as a mess attendant, still cooking and cleaning while white sailors with less impressive combat records received promotions and acclaim. The message was clear. Miller might be a hero, but he was still a black sailor, and the Navy would decide what that meant. Finally, in November 1942, the Navy relented. Miller returned to Pearl Harbor and was ordered on a war bond tour. From December 1942 through January 1943, he gave presentations in Oakland, California, in his hometown of Waco, in Dallas, and to the first graduating class of black sailors from Great Lakes Naval Training Station near Chicago. Miller was the first African-American allowed on a war bond speaking tour. Think about that. White heroes had been touring for a year, selling bonds and inspiring citizens. Miller, whose actions at Pearl Harbor were among the most dramatic of any sailor that day, had to wait 13 months and endure a pressure campaign from the black press before the Navy would let him speak publicly. During the tour, Miller's image appeared on a Navy recruiting poster. The poster showed Miller in his uniform, wearing his Navy cross, beneath the words, "Above and beyond the call of duty." The image was designed by David Stone Martin and distributed to recruitment centers across the country. The irony was brutal. The Navy was using Miller to recruit black sailors, while maintaining policies that ensured those sailors would face the same discrimination Miller had endured. "Join the Navy," the poster suggested, "and you too can be a hero." What it didn't mention was that you'd be a hero restricted to the mess hall, forbidden from training on weapons, serving white officers who refused to see you as an equal. But Miller's story was having an effect that Secretary Knox and other segregationists couldn't stop. In April 1942, even before Miller received the Navy Cross, Knox had announced the opening of Camp Robert Smalls, an all-black naval training facility in Illinois. The Navy began enlisting black men for ratings beyond mess attendant. They opened positions for gunner's mates, radiomen, radar operators. Small steps, incremental changes, but changes nonetheless. Miller had proven something undeniable. Black sailors could fight, and if they could fight, then every justification for segregation crumbled. The Navy's entire system was built on the premise that black men couldn't handle the responsibility of combat. Miller had shattered that premise in 15 minutes of sustained fire at an enemy he wasn't supposed to be qualified to fight. On June 1, 1942, Miller was promoted to Mess Attendant First Class. On June 1, 1943, he was promoted again to Ship's Cook Third Class. The promotions came a year apart, each one marking grudging recognition that Miller had earned advancement. But notice the ratings. Mess Attendant and Cook. Even as a decorated hero, even as the first black recipient of the Navy Cross, Miller was still restricted to feeding people. In May 1943, Miller was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay. The Casablanca-class escort carrier was barely 300 feet long, hastily built as part of the massive wartime shipbuilding program. Sailors called ships like the Liscombe Bay CVE for their hull classification. But the joke among crews was darker. Combustible, vulnerable, expendable. The Liscombe Bay departed Pearl Harbor on November 10, 1943, as part of Task Force 52, bound for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. The operation was designated Galvanic, and it marked one of America's first major offensives in the Central Pacific. Miller was back in combat, back in harm's way, still serving his country despite knowing exactly how his country viewed him. On November 20th, American forces invaded Marken Atoll. The Liscombe Bay's aircraft provided air support for the landings. For 3 days, the carrier steamed off Marken, launching strikes and supporting the troops ashore. By November 23rd, the island was secured. The task force prepared to withdraw. The Japanese submarine I-175, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata, had arrived off Marken and was stalking the American task force. On the morning of November 24th, at 5:13 a.m., the submarine fired a spread of torpedoes at the carriers. One torpedo struck the Liscombe Bay's stern, near the after-engine room. Under normal circumstances, a single torpedo hit, even on a thin-skinned escort carrier, wouldn't necessarily sink the ship. But the torpedo detonated the Liscombe Bay's bomb magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. Lieutenant John C.W. Dix, the communications officer on the destroyer USS Hull, watched from his ship. It didn't look like a ship at all. We thought it was an ammunition dump. She just went whoom, an orange ball of flame. The Liscombe Bay listed to starboard and sank in 23 minutes. Of the 916 officers and men aboard, only 272 survived. The rest, including Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix, Captain Irving D. Wiltse, and ship's cook third-class Doris Miller, went down with the ship. It remains the deadliest sinking of an aircraft carrier in United States Navy history. On December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Doris Miller's parents received the telegram informing them that their son was missing and presumed dead. He was 24 years old. The Navy officially declared Miller dead on November 25, 1944, 1 year and a day after the Liscombe Bay sank. His body was never recovered. He rests somewhere in the waters off Butaritari Island, with more than 600 of his shipmates. Miller's legacy didn't die with him. In March 1944, just 4 months after Miller's death, the Navy commissioned its first black officers. They became known as the Golden 13, and their path to commissioning had been cleared in part by Miller's example. In February 1946, the Navy officially ended racial segregation with Circular Order 48-46. The process wasn't instantaneous or easy, but the system that had forced Doris Miller to collect laundry instead of training for combat was finally dismantled. Over the decades, Miller has been honored repeatedly. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate, making it only the third naval vessel named for a black sailor. A 9-foot bronze statue of Miller was unveiled in Waco on December 7, 2017. In 2010, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring Miller as one of 4 distinguished sailors. And on January 19, 2020, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Navy announced that its next Ford-class nuclear aircraft carrier would be named USS Doris Miller, designated CVN-81. It will be the first aircraft carrier named for an African American and the first carrier named for an enlisted sailor. The $15 billion vessel, the most advanced and expensive warship ever built, will carry Miller's name into service around 2030. But there's one honor Miller has never received: the Medal of Honor. Bills have been introduced in Congress multiple times, most recently in 2016, 2017, and 2020, to posthumously award Miller the Medal of Honor. None have passed. The Navy maintains that Miller's actions, while heroic, don't meet the standard for the nation's highest military decoration. They claim there's no evidence of racial discrimination in the decision. That claim is difficult to accept when you examine what happened on December 7, 1941. 16 men received the Medal of Honor for actions at Pearl Harbor. All were white. Most were officers or petty officers. Their actions were undoubtedly heroic. But were they more heroic than a 22-year-old mess attendant who carried wounded men to safety, manned a weapon he'd never been trained to use, fought effectively against attacking aircraft for 15 minutes, and then continued rescuing sailors after his ship sank? Miller did all this while knowing that military regulations actually forbade him from operating that weapon. He could have faced court-martial for touching that gun. He did it anyway because men were dying and someone needed to fight back. That's not just heroism. That's heroism compounded by the courage to violate the unjust rules of a segregated system. Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson, a Democrat from Dallas who grew up in the same Waco neighborhood as Miller, has been fighting for decades to get Miller the Medal of Honor. She remembers seeing Miller during his stateside tour before he returned to duty. She remembers, at age 7, going door to door with her father, raising money to honor Miller in their community. I have lobbied the Department of the Navy about as much as I know how to lobby them, Johnson said in 2016. I've been working on it ever since I've been here, and I don't know that I am any closer. The Navy's requirement for reopening Miller's case is new and relevant material evidence that wasn't available in 1942. But what new evidence could possibly emerge? The actions are documented. The witnesses are dead. The only thing that's changed is America's understanding of how deeply racism shaped every aspect of military service in 1941. Maybe that's the evidence the Navy refuses to acknowledge. Doris Miller didn't set out to be a civil rights hero. He set out to earn money for his family and see something beyond Waco, Texas. But when the moment came, when the bombs fell and the ship burned, he became exactly what the Navy claimed black sailors could never be, a warrior who fought with skill, courage, and honor. The name Dory, that so many stories use, that might have come from a typographical error in the Pittsburgh Courier's first article identifying him. Miller's actual name was Doris, the name given by a midwife who thought he'd be a girl, the name he carried with quiet confidence his entire life. It's fitting, in a way, that even his name became contested ground. The Navy that tried not to acknowledge his existence, that waited months to identify him, that fought against properly honoring him, couldn't even get his name right in the stories they finally told. But Miller never complained. He did his duty, accepted his decorations with grace, spoke on his war bond tour with dignity, and returned to combat, knowing the Navy still saw him as less than fully equal. He died serving a country that didn't fully accept him. He died protecting a system that had tried to limit him, and he did it anyway, because that's what duty means when you understand it at the deepest level. 23 minutes. That's how long it took for the USS Liscombe Bay to sink after the torpedo hit. In those 23 minutes, as the ship burned and listed and broke apart, as men jumped into the water and ammunition exploded and fires consumed the flight deck, Doris Miller faced death a second time. We don't know what he did in those final minutes. We don't know if he helped other men escape, if he fought the fires, if he tried to save the ship. But we know who he was. We know what he'd already proven. And we can guess that when the Liscombe Bay went down, Doris Miller was still fighting, still helping, still doing his duty to the very end. His mother, Henrietta Miller, kept his memory alive in Waco. His father, Connery Miller, spoke about his son with pride. His brothers, one of whom also served in the army during World War II, carried his legacy forward. The community that had watched him grow from a sharecropper's son to a football star to a Navy hero never forgot. And gradually, despite the Navy's initial reluctance, despite Secretary Knox's opposition, despite the Medal of Honor that never came, America began to remember too. Today, Doris Miller's story is taught in schools. His image is in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. His name will sail on the mightiest warship ever built. Children in Waco and across America learn about the mess attendant who manned the gun, the hero the Navy tried to erase, the man whose 15 minutes of courage helped change a nation. But here's what we shouldn't forget. Miller was a hero at Pearl Harbor, yes, but he was also a hero every day he wore the uniform of a segregated Navy. Every day he served meals to officers who wouldn't salute him. Every day he cleaned berthing spaces he wasn't allowed to sleep in. Every day he watched white sailors train on weapons he'd never touch, while knowing he was just as capable, just as dedicated, just as American. That's a different kind of courage. That's the courage to serve with dignity in a system designed to strip you of it. That's the courage to love a country that doesn't fully love you back. That's the courage that Doris Miller showed for 2 years and 3 months between September 16th, 1939 and December 7th, 1941, before anyone knew his name. The 15 minutes at Pearl Harbor made him famous. The rest of his service made him a hero, and his story reminds us of an uncomfortable truth about American history. The same men we celebrate for defeating fascism abroad often defended bigotry at home. The same Navy that fought for freedom in the Pacific maintained a segregated system that denied freedom to its own sailors. The same nation that declared all men created equal took 200 years to begin acting like it meant all men. Doris Miller didn't fix that contradiction. One man couldn't, but he exposed it. He proved that the justifications for segregation were lies. He demonstrated that capability has nothing to do with race and everything to do with opportunity. And he did it while the bombs fell and the ship sank and men died around him. The USS Doris Miller, when it enters service, will be a floating city, over 1,100 feet long, powered by nuclear reactors, carrying 75 aircraft and 4,500 sailors. It will project American power anywhere in the world, and it will carry the name of a man who once collected laundry in the bowels of a battleship because that was the only job the Navy would give him. That's progress, real and measurable, but it also reminds us how far we had to come, how much we had to change, how many Doris Millers there must have been who never got the chance to show what they could do. His story matters because he matters, not as a symbol, though he became that, not as a tool for recruitment posters, though he was used that way, but as a man, a son, a brother, a sailor who did his duty when it mattered most and paid the ultimate price for a nation still learning to honor his sacrifice. Doris Miller. Remember the name, his real name. Not the typo, not the nickname, but the name given to him at birth, carried with pride, and honored finally. Too late for him to know, but not too late for us to learn from. He was 24 years old when he died. He served 4 years, 2 months, and 8 days in the United States Navy. He earned the Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, the American Defense Service Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He earned the Medal of Honor, too. His country just never gave it to him.